Audiobook. The Agony and the Ecstasy. Author, Irving Stone. Book 3. The Palace. A page escorted him up the grand staircase and along the corridor to an apartment opposite the central courtyard. The page knocked. Bertoldo opened the door. "Welcome, Michelangelo, to my home. Il Magnifico thinks I have so little time left, he wants me to teach you in my sleep." Michelangelo found himself in an L-shaped interior dividing into separate rooms. There were 2 wooden beds covered with white blankets and red coverlets, each with a coffer at its foot. Bertoldo had his bed on the inside of the L. Covering a wall above his head was a painted tapestry representing the Palazzo della Signoria. There was a big cupboard turned cat-a-corner against the inside angle of the L, filled with Bertoldo's books, including the pigskin-bound manuscript of his cookbook, bronze candlesticks which he had designed for Donatello, and on the various levels the wax or clay models of most of his sculptures. Michelangelo's bed was in the door half of the L, from which he could see the sculptures on the cupboard but nothing of Bertoldo's bed area. On the wall opposite the bed was a wooden tablet with the baptistry painted on it, and next to a window overlooking the Via d'Agoria hat rack and a table with a vase and a pitcher of water. "This arrangement will give us privacy," said Bertoldo. "Put your things in the coffer at the foot of your bed. If you have any valuables I'll lock them in this antique chest." Michelangelo glanced at his small bundle of clothes and darn stockings. "My only valuables are my 2 hands, I like to keep them by my side. They'll take you farther than your feet will." They retired early, Bertoldo lighting the candles in the bronze holders which sent flickering fingers of light into both wings. They could not see each other, yet their beds were only a few feet apart and they could talk in a quiet tone. The one thing they could both see was the cat-a-cornered cupboard, with the models of Bertoldo's work. "Your sculptures look beautiful in the candlelight." Bertoldo was silent for a moment. Polzano says, "Bertoldo is not a sculptor of miniatures, he is a miniature sculptor." Michelangelo drew in his breath sharply. Bertoldo heard the sound of protest, said softly, "There is an element of truth in that cruel witticism. Isn't it a bit pathetic that from your pillow you can take in with one glance my whole lifetime of work?" "But, Bertoldo, sculpture isn't measured by how many pounds it weighs. By any measurement it is a modest contribution. Talent is cheap, dedication is expensive. It will cost you your life. What else is life for?" Bertoldo sighed. "Alas, I thought it was for many things, falconing, testing recipes, pursuing pretty girls. You know the Florentine adage, life is to be enjoyed. The sculptor must create a body of work. He must produce for 50 to 60 years, as Garibaldi and Donatello did. He must produce enough to permeate the whole world." The old man was tired. Michelangelo heard him sigh into sleep. He himself lay awake, his hands locked behind his head. He could think of no difference between life is to be enjoyed and life is work. Here he was, living in the Medici palace, enjoying the contemplation of unlimited artworks to study, and a corner of the sculpture garden full of beautiful marble to carve. He fell asleep with a smile on his lips. He woke with the first sunlight, quietly dressed and went out into the halls of the palace. He ran his hands over the antique marble of Marsyas, the figures of Faustina and Africanus, studied the richly colored Venetian paintings in what appeared to be a drawing room, contrasted portraits in paint by Paul Amaguolo with portraits in marble by Mino da Fassole, spent an hour in the chapel glorying in the Benozzo Gozzoli frescoes of the 3 wise men of the East coming down the hill from Fassole, knocked on doors and entered to find himself gazing in wide-eyed wonder and awe at Donatello's Ascension, Masaccio Street, Paul Michelangelo Battle of San Romano. Until he became so lightheaded he thought he must be in a dream. At 11 he returned to his room to find that the palace tailor had left a new outfit on his bed. In a festive mood he slipped on the colorful silks, then stood before the mirror surveying himself with satisfaction. It was amazing how much more attractive the new clothes made him look, the crimson barretto sending color into his cheeks, the cowl collar of the violet cloak making his head seem better proportioned, the golden shirt and stockings adding a sheen of gaiety. He remembered the day, 2 years before, when he had sat on his bed redrawing his features with a crayon while awaiting grain excise summoning whistle. As he postured before the mirror he was delighted at the changes in himself. He had not only added a couple of inches of height, now standing 5 feet 4, but he had put on some weight. The high bone ridges of his cheeks no longer seemed skeletal, and with the growth of his mouth and chin it was not so noticeable that his ears were placed too far back on his head. He combed his curly hair forward to cover part of the too broad forehead. His small, heavy-lidded eyes seemed more widely open, their secure expression reflected his having found a place for himself in the world. People need no longer think his face out of plumb. He worshipped beauty in others, and had so little himself. At 13 he had reconciled himself to being small, burdened with an insignificant figure. Having the deepest admiration for the magnificent strength and proportion of the male body, his own mediocre limbs and torso had seemed a tattered cloak. Now he no longer cut so dull a figure. In his absorption, he did not see Bertoldo enter. "Oh, Bertoldo. I was just. You fancy yourself in that raiment? I didn't know I could look like this." "You can't. They're for festa only. Isn't Sunday dinner a holiday? Put on this blouse and tunic. Come the day of the Virgin, you can show off." Michelangelo sighed, took off the violet cloak and unlaced the fine yellow linen blouse, then glanced mischievously at his teacher. "Oh well, put not an embroidered crupper on a plough horse." They made their way up the broad staircase from the entresol to the long foyer, then turned sharply to the right into the dining room. He was surprised to find himself in a severe room without a single work of art. The panel frames and lintels were done in gold leaf, the walls in a cool cream color, quiet and restrained. There was a table across the end, seating a dozen, and coming down both sides at right angles to it 2 more tables formed the U, seating another dozen inside and out, so that no one was more than a few slender gilt chairs from Lorenzo, and 60 could dine in intimacy. They were early. Michelangelo held back in the doorway. Lorenzo, who had Contessina on his right and a Florentine merchant on his left, saw them. "Ah, Michelangelo, come sit near us. We have no prearranged places, whoever comes first takes the nearest empty seat." Contessina put her hand on the chair next to hers, inviting him to join her. As he sat down he noticed the beautiful table settings, square-shaped crystal glasses with gold trim, silver plates with the Florentine giglio, lily, inlaid in gold, silver knives, spoons with the Medici crest of 6 raised balls, 3, 2 and 1. As he presented his compliments to Lorenzo, palace pages were moving green plants to reveal the palace orchestra in the shell-shaped niche behind him, a harpsichord with the double keyboard, a harp, 3 big violas, a large lute. "Welcome to the palace, Michelangelo," said Contessina. "Father says you are to be one of the family. Am I to call you brother?" He knew he was being teased, asked himself, "Why was I born with a heavy tongue?" After a moment he replied, "Perhaps cousin would be better?" Contessina chuckled. "It's pleasant for me that your first dinner is on a Sunday. Other days women are not permitted at table. We have our meals in the upper loggia. Then I am not to see you during the week?" he blurted out. Her eyes were as round as Giotto's. "Oh, the palace is not that large." He watched the colorful array of diners as they entered as though into the court of a king, while the musicians played Un Cavaliere di Spagna. Lorenzo's daughter Lucrezia and her husband Jacopo Salviati, Lorenzo's second cousins Giovanni and Lorenzo de' Medici, whom Lorenzo had raised and educated after they were orphaned, Prior Bicciolini, brilliant and bespectacled head of the Augustinian order at the Church of Santo Spirito, which housed the libraries of Petrarch and Boccaccio, Giuliano da San Gallo, who had designed the exquisite villa at Poggio Caiano, the Duke of Milan en route to Rome with his retinue, the ambassador from the Sultan of Turkey, 2 cardinals from Spain, reigning families from Bologna, Ferrara, Arezzo, scholars from Paris and Berlin bringing manuscripts, treatises, works of art, members of the Signoria of Florence, bland, homely Piero Soderini, whom Lorenzo was training to become chief magistrate of Florence, an emissary from the Doge of Venice, visiting professors from the University of Bologna, prosperous city merchants and their wives, visiting businessmen from Athens, Pekin, Alexandria, London. All came to pay their respects to their host. Contassina kept up a running identification. Here were Demetrius Chalcontiles, head of Lorenzo's Public Academy of Greek and co-publisher of the first printed edition of Homer, Vespasiano da Bistasi, leading bibliophile and dealer in rare manuscripts who supplied the libraries of the late Pope Nicholas V, Alessandro Sforza, the Earl of Worcester, and the Medici, the English scholars Thomas Linacre and William Grosson, who were studying under Polizano and Chalcontiles of Lorenzo's Platonic Academy, Johann Reuchlin, the German humanist and disciple of Pico della Mirandola, the monk Francis Mariano, for whom Lorenzo had built a monastery outside the Porta San Gallo designed by Giuliano da San Gallo, an emissary bearing news of the sudden death of Matthias of Hungary, who had admired the philosopher Prince Lorenzo. Piero de' Medici, oldest son of Lorenzo, and his elegantly gowned wife Alfonsina Orsini, came in late and had to take places at the foot of one of the long tables. Michelangelo saw that they were offended. "Piero and Alfonsina don't approve of all this republicanism," Contassina whispered. "They think we should hold court, with only Medici allowed at the head table, and the plebeians seated below us." Giovanni, Lorenzo's second son, and his cousin Giulio entered, Giovanni with his tonsure fresh shaved, the eye with the cast involuntarily blinking. He had his mother's light brown hair and fair complexion, was tall and corpulent, with a heavy face and plump underchin. Giulio, illegitimate son of Lorenzo's dead brother, was dark, handsome, saturnine. His eyes slashed through the assemblage, separating every personage and relationship. He missed nothing that could be useful to him. The last to enter was Nannina de' Medici on the arm of a handsome, brilliantly dressed man. "My Aunt Nannina," murmured Contassina, and her husband Bernardo Rucellai. "He's a good poet, father says, he writes plays. Sometimes the Plato Academy meets in his garden." Michelangelo's eyes studied every aspect of this cousin of his mother. He said nothing to Contassina of the relationship. The musicians began to play Corinto, the music of which had been set to one of Lorenzo's poems. 2 serving men who stood at the lifts began hauling up the food. As the waiters passed among the diners with heavy silver trays of freshwater fish, Michelangelo was staggered to see a youngish man in a multicolored shirt pick up a small fish, put it to his ear, then to his mouth as though talking to it, and after a moment burst into tears. All eyes were centered on him. Michelangelo turned his perplexed gaze on Contassina. "Jacko, the palace buffoon. Laugh. Be a Florentine." "Why are you crying, Jacko?" asked Lorenzo. "My father was drowned some years ago." I asked this little fish whether he ever saw him anywhere. He said he was too young to have met him and suggested that I ask those bigger fish who may know more about the matter. Lorenzo, amused, said, "Give Jacko some of the big fishes so that he may interrogate them." The laughter had an annealing quality. Strangers at Lorenzo's table who had never met and perhaps came from diametrically opposed ways of life began talking with the people around them. Michelangelo, who knew not the nature of fun and had been shocked to find a buffoon at Lorenzo's table, felt his disapproving scowl soften. Contessina had been watching him. "Don't you like to laugh?" "I am unpracticed. No one laughs in my house. You are what my French tutor calls un homme sérieux. But my father is a serious man too, it's just that he believes laughter can be useful. You will see when you have lived with us for a time." The fish dish was removed and he was served with fritto misto. Michelangelo was too fascinated watching Lorenzo as he spoke and turned to some 30 or 40 guests to more than taste the food. "Il magnifico, does he work through the entire meal? He enjoys all these people, the noise and talk and fun. Yet at the same time he sits down with 100 purposes in mind, and rises with them all accomplished." The servants at the lift took off young suckling pigs roasted on a spit, with rosemary in their mouths. Il cartier, an improviser upon the lyre, entertained by singing the news and gossip of the week accompanied by satiric comments and rhymed and cadenced verse. After dessert the guests promenaded in the wide foyer. Contessina slipped her arm through his. "Do you know what it means to be a friend?" she asked. "Granexi has tried to teach me. Everyone is a friend to the Medici," she said quietly, "and no one." The following morning he and Bertoldo walked through the sentient air of early spring, the sky a cerulean blue, the stones of Florence fire gold as they absorbed the sun. Above them on the hills of Fesole each cypress, villa and monastery stood out from the green-gray background of olives and vines. They went to the far end of the garden, to the collection of marble blocks. It was as though they were standing in an ancient cemetery whose tumbled headstones had been bleached by the sun. Bertoldo turned to his protégé with a shy expression in his pale blue eyes. "Admittedly, I am not a great marble carver. But with you perhaps I can become a great teacher." "Here's a beautiful piece of meat," Michelangelo cried impetuously. Bertoldo smiled at this use of the quarryman's vernacular. "The figure you want to carve must run with the block. You will know whether you're going with the grain by the way it chips when you hit it. To see how the veins run, pour water on the block. The tiny black marks, even in good marble, are iron stains. Sometimes they can be chipped off. If you hit an iron vein you will feel it because it is much harder than marble, and it will bear metal on the metal of the stone. Makes my teeth grind to think of it. Every time you hit the marble with a chisel you mash crystals. A mashed crystal is a dead crystal. Dead crystals ruin sculpture. You must learn to carve great blocks without crushing the crystals." "When?" "Later." Bertoldo told him about air bubbles, the spots in the marble that fall out or become hollow after weathering. They cannot be seen from the outside, and one must learn to know when they are inside. It was like selecting an apple, one could tell it was wholesome because it bulged forth in healthy form into space, while a rotting apple tended to become concave, as if being subdued by space. Marble is like man, you have to know everything that is in it before you start. If there are concealed air bubbles in you, I'm wasting my time." Michelangelo made a childish joke which Bertoldo ignored, going instead for a set of tools from the shed. "Here is a punch. It is a tool to remove. Here are an agnuto and a scarpello. They are the tools to form. Bertoldo demonstrated that even when he was tearing out marble to get rid of what he did not want, he must work with rhythmical strokes so that he achieved circular lines around the block. He was never to complete any one part, but work on all parts, balancing relationships. Did he understand? I will, after you turn me loose among these marbles. I learn through my hands, not my ears. Then take the wax out. That fun wasn't too bad, but you arrived at your results through blind intuition. For consistent results you have to know why you are doing what. The outdoor sculpture workshop was a combination forge, carpenter's and blacksmith's shop. There was on hand a supply of beams, wedges, wooden horses, saws, bevels, hammers, wood chisels to repair the handles of hammers. The floor was cement to allow for solid footing. Standing alongside the forge were newly arrived rods of Swedish iron that Granixite had bought the day before so that Michelangelo could make himself a full set of 9 chisels. Bertoldo told him to start a fire in the forge. Chestnut wood made the best charcoal and produced a slow, intense, even heat. I already know how to temper tools for Beatrice Serena, said Michelangelo. The Topolinos taught me. With the fire started, he reached for the blower, an enclosed wheel with metal slabs about its circumference, to feed it a good draft. Basta, exclaimed Bertoldo. Tap these iron rods together and see if they ring like bells. The rods were good grade iron, all except one, which was discarded. When the fire was hot enough, he became immersed in making his first set of tools. He knew that the man who does not make his own tools does not make his own sculpture. The hours passed. They did not stop for dinner. Dusk was falling when the old man became faint, his skin ashen gray. He would have fallen if Michelangelo had not caught him in his arms. He carried him to the casino, marveling that Bertoldo could weigh so little, less than a rod of Swedish ore. He put his teacher down gently on a chair. How could I have let you work so long? He groaned. A little color spread over the brittle bones of Bertoldo's cheeks. It is not enough to handle marble, you must also have iron in your blood. The next morning Michelangelo rose in the dark, quietly so that he would not waken Bertoldo, walked through the sleeping streets in order to be in the garden at dawn. He knew that it was the first rays of the sun that revealed the truth about marble. Under these piercing rays marble was almost translucent, all veins, faults, hollows were mercilessly exposed. Quality that could survive the earliest sun would be intact when night fell. He went from block to block taping with his hammer. The solid blocks gave out a bell-like sound, the defective ones a dull thud. One small piece that had been exposed to the weather for a long time had developed a tough skin. With hammer and chisel he cut away the membranous coating to get to the pure milky substance below. Wanting to learn the direction of the vein, he held his hammer tightly and fractured off the high corners. He liked what he saw, took a piece of charcoal and drew the head and beard of an old man on the marble. Then he pulled up a bench, straddled the block, gripping it with both knees, picked up hammer and chisel. His body settled down with the sawing movement. Tensions within him fell away with each falling chip. Stone filled him out, gave him body, he felt implemented and whole. His arm grew lighter and stronger with the passing of the hours. These metal tools clothed him in their own armor. They made him robust. He thought, as Torrigiani loves the feel of a gun in his hand, Sansovino the plow, Rusticity the rough coat of a dog, and Baccio a woman, just so am I happiest with a block of marble between my legs and a hammer and chisel in my hands. White marble was the heart of the universe, the purest substance created by God, not merely a symbol of God but a portrait, God's way of manifesting himself. Only a divine hand could create such noble beauty. He felt himself a part of the white purity before him, felt its integrity as though it were his own. He remembered Bertoldo quoting Donatello, "Sculpture is an art which, by removing all that is superfluous from the material under treatment, reduces it to that form designed in the artist's mind." Was it not equally true that the sculptor could never force any design on the marble which was not indigenous to its own nature? He had the impression that, no matter how honestly a sculptor designed, it would come to nothing if it did not agree with the basic nature of the block. In this sense a sculptor could never be completely master of his fate, as a painter could be. Paint was fluid, it could bend around corners. Marble was solidity itself. The marble sculptor had to accept the rigorous discipline of a partnership. The marble and he were one. They spoke to each other. And for him, the feel of marble was the supreme sensation. No gratification of any other sense, taste, sight, sound, smell, could approach it. He had removed the outer shell. Now he dug into the mass, entered in the biblical sense. In this act of creation there was needed the thrust, the penetration, the beating and pulsating upward to a mighty climax, the total possession. It was not merely an act of love, it was the act of love, the mating of his own inner patterns to the inherent forms of the marble, an insemination in which he planted seed, created the living work of art. Bertoldo entered the shop, saw Michelangelo at work, cried out, "No, no, that's wrong. Stop. That's the amateur way to carve." Michelangelo heard the voice over the pounding of his hammer, turned to flash recognition, but without ceasing the gouging out movement of his agnuto. "Michelangelo. You're beginning at the wrong end." Michelangelo did not hear him. Bertoldo turned away from the sight of his apprentice cutting a furrow through the stone as though it were quince jelly. He shook his head in amused despair. As well try to keep Vesuvius from erupting. That evening he bathed in a tub of hot water placed for him in a small room at the end of his hallway, put on a dark blue shirt and hose and accompanied Bertoldo to Lorenzo's studiolo for supper. He was nervous. What would he say? The Plato Academy was reported to be the intellectual heart of Europe, a university and a printing press, a fount of literature and a world-exploring expedition which had for its purpose the turning of Florence into a second Athens. If only he had listened to Irving when his teacher had been reading from the old Greek manuscripts. There was a fire crackling in the hearth, warm light in the brass lamps on Lorenzo's writing desk, a pleasant air of camaraderie. 7 chairs were drawn up to a low table. The shelves of books, Greek reliefs, cases of cameos and amulets made the room intimate and cozy. The Plato group received him casually, then returned to their discussion of the comparative worth of medicine and astrology as sciences, giving Michelangelo an opportunity to sort out the faces and personalities of the 4 scholars who are reputed to be the outstanding brains of Italy. Marsilio Ficino, 57, had founded the Plato Academy for Cosimo, Lorenzo's grandfather. He was a tiny man, under 5 feet, and though suffering the continuing ills of the hypochondriac he had translated all of Plato and become a living dictionary of ancient philosophies by translating the body of Egyptian wisdom before devouring the work of the sages from Aristotle through the Alexandrians, Confucianists, Zoroastrians. Trained by his father to be a doctor, he was well acquainted with the natural sciences as well. He had helped introduce the printing of books in Florence. His own writings attracted scholars from all over Europe who came to listen to his lectures. In his beautiful villa in Cergy, which Cosimo had Michelangelo designed for him, and which was managed by his nieces, he burned an undying lamp in front of a statue of Plato, whom he was trying to have canonized as the dearest of Christ's disciples, an act of heresy as well as inverted history for which Rome had very nearly excommunicated him. His nieces quipped. He can recite the whole of a Plato dialogue, but he can never remember where he left his slippers. Michelangelo next turned his attention to Cristoforo Longino, about 66, daughter of Lorenzo's father, Piero the Gauti, and of Lorenzo himself, brilliant writer and lecturer, training the Florentine mind to free itself from dogma and to apply the findings of science to nature. He had served as confidential secretary to the Signoria, was experienced in politics, and a leader of the Medici circle for 3 generations. He was the Dante authority, having published his commentary and the first version of the Divine Comedy printed in Florence. His lifetime work centered around the Italian language, the Vulgate, which almost single-handed he was turning from a despised argot into a respected language by translating into it Pliny, Horace, Virgil. He was known in Florence for his revolutionary credo: the deepest basis for action is the clear supremacy of contemplation and knowledge. In Lorenzo he had found the hero of Plato's Republic. The ideal ruler of a city is the scholar. Perched on the edge of a stiff leather chair was Angelo Bilizzano, 36 years of age, who was said by opponents of the Medici to be kept close at hand because by contrast he made Lorenzo appear attractive. Yet he was acknowledged to be the most fantastic scholar there, publishing in Latin at the age of 10, invited into the Florentine Compagnia di Dottrina at 12 to be trained by Ficino, Longino and the Greek scholars brought to Florence by the Medici. He had translated the first books of Homer's Iliad by 16 and been taken into the palace by Lorenzo to become tutor to his sons. One of the ugliest of men, he was possessed of as lucid and limpid a style as any poet since Petrarch. His stanza per l'Agiostro di Giuliano, a book-length poem celebrating the tournament of Giuliano de' Medici, Lorenzo's younger brother, killed by the Pazzi, had become a model for Italian poetry. Michelangelo's eyes now went to the youngest and most attractive of the group, 27-year-old Pico della Mirandola, who read and wrote in 22 languages. The other members of the group teased him by saying, "The only reason Pico doesn't know a 23rd is that he can't find one." Known as the Great Lord of Italy, with a sweet and sincere nature, unspoiled by his soft golden hair, deep blue eyes, flawless blonde skin, slender figure, Florentines called him beautiful and beloved. His intellectual concept was the unity of knowledge, his ambition, to reconcile all religions and philosophies since the beginning of time. Like Ficino, he aspired to hold in his mind the totality of human learning. To this end he read Chinese philosophers in Chinese, Arabic in Arabic, Hebrew in Hebrew, believing that all languages were rational divisions of one universal language. Of all Italians the most divinely gifted, he yet made no enemies, even as ugly Bilizzano could make no friends. The door opened. Lorenzo entered, limping from an attack of his recurrent gout. He nodded to the others, turned to Michelangelo. "This is the Sancta Sanctorum. Most of what Florence learns is started in this room. When we are in the palace, and you are free, join us." Lorenzo moved an ornamented screen and knocked on the dumbwaiter behind, from which Michelangelo assumed that the studiolo was directly below the dining room. He heard the platform moving inside the shaft, and within a few moments the academicians were taking plates of cheese, fruit, bread, honey, nuts and setting them on the low table in the center of the room. There were no servants about, nor was there anything but milk to drink. Though the talk was light, Michelangelo perceived that the group met for work, and after supper wine made the hair swell. The table was cleared, the plates, fruit rinds and nutshells dispatched down the lift. At once the conversation became serious. Sitting on a low stool beside Bertoldo, Michelangelo heard the case against the church, which the scholars in this room no longer considered synonymous with their religion. Florence in particular was a seat of disaffection because Lorenzo and the majority of his fellow townsmen agreed that Pope Sixtus of Rome had been behind the Pazzi conspiracy, which had resulted in the murder of Giuliano and the almost fatal stabbing of Lorenzo. The Pope had excommunicated Florence, forbidding the clergy to fulfill the duties of their office. Florence in turn had excommunicated the Pope, declaring the papal claims to power were based on such 8th-century forgeries as the donation of Constantino. The Pope, in an effort to crush Lorenzo, had sent troops into Tuscany, which had burned and pillaged as close as the neighboring town of Poggibonsi. With the advent of Innocent VIII in 1484, peace had been re-established between Florence and Rome. But as Michelangelo heard the evidence summarized by the men around the table, it appeared that much of the Tuscan clergy had become increasingly immoral in personal conduct as well as in clerical practice. The outstanding exception was the Augustinian order at Santo Spirito, living in flawless self-discipline under Pier Bicciolini. Pico della Mirandola put his elbows on the low table, resting his chin on his clasped hands. "I think I may have come upon an answer to our dilemma over the church, in the form of a Dominican monk from Ferrara. I've heard him preach there. He shakes the ribs of the cathedral." Longino, whose white hair was worn long and back, with tufts coming over his forehead, leaned across the table, so that Michelangelo could see the fine network of wrinkles circling his eyes. "This monk, is he all volume?" "On the contrary, Longino," replied Pico, "he's a brilliant student of the Bible and St. Augustine. He feels even more strongly about the corruption of the clergy than we do." Angelo Bellizzano, of the heavy features and coarse black hair worn string-like down over his ears and covering part of the rough skin, moistened his overly red, projecting underlip. "It's not only the corruption, it's the ignorance that appalls me." Ficino, light-complexioned, with a bright, perceptive face and tiny nose and mouth, cried out eagerly, "It's been a long time since we've had a scholar in a Florentine pulpit. We have only Francis Mariano and Pier Bicciolini. Girolamo Savonarola has given himself over 2 years of study," Pico assured them. "Plato and Aristotle as well as church doctrine." "What are his ambitions?" asked Lorenzo. "To purify the church." "Nothing more?" "What about power?" "Only the power within him." "If this monk would work with us," proffered Lorenzo. "If your excellency will request his transfer of the Lombard fathers, I'll attend to it." The subject settled, the oldest, Longino, and the youngest, Pico, now turned their attention to Michelangelo. Longino asked if he had read what Pliny wrote about the famous Greek statue of the Laocoon. "I know nothing of Pliny." "Then I shall read it to you." He took a book down from the shelf, quickly thumbed through it and read the story of the statue in the palace of Emperor Titus, a work that may be looked upon as preferable to any other production of the art of painting or of statuary. It is sculptured from a single block, both the main figures as well as the children, and the serpents with their marvelous folds. Polizano followed with a description of the Venus of Cnidos from Lucian, which represented Venus standing before Paris when he awarded her the prize of beauty. Pico then remembered the penta-like marble statue at the tomb of Xenophon. "Michelangelo will want to read Pausanias in the original," said Pico. "I will bring you my manuscript." "I don't read Greek," said Michelangelo a bit ashamedly. "I will teach you. I do not have the gift for languages." "No matter," interceded Polizano, "in a year you will be writing sonnets in Latin as well as Greek." To himself, Michelangelo murmured, "Permit me to doubt." But it would be bad manners to kill the enthusiasm of these new friends who were now arguing among themselves as to which books he should be taught from. Homer. For Greek, he is the purest. Aristophanes is more fun. to laugh while learning. He was relieved when the group turned its attention away from him. The most important idea he gleaned from the swift, learned talk was that religion and knowledge could exist side by side, enriching each other. Greece and Rome, before the dawn of Christianity, had built gloriously in the arts, humanities, sciences, philosophy. Then for 1,000 years all such wisdom and beauty had been crushed, declared anathema, buried in darkness. Now this little group of men, the sensual Polizano, the lean Longino, the tiny Ficino, the golden-haired Pico della Mirandola, these few fragile men, led and aided by Lorenzo de' Medici, were attempting to create a new intellect under the banner of a word Michelangelo had never heard before. Humanism. What did it mean? As the hours wore on he found himself caught up in interest. So much so that when Bertoldo signaled that he was leaving, slipping out quietly, Michelangelo remained. And as each of the Platonists poured out his thoughts he slowly gathered the sense of what they meant. We are giving the world back to man, and man back to himself. Man shall no longer be vile, but noble. We shall not destroy his mind in return for an immortal soul. Without a free, vigorous and creative mind, man is but an animal, and he will die like an animal, without any shred of a soul. We return to man his arts, his literature, his sciences, his independence to think and feel as an individual, not to be bound to dogma like a slave, to rot in his chains. At the end of the evening when he returned to his room and found Bertoldo still awake, he blurted out, "They make me feel so stupid. They are the best minds in Europe. They can give you heroic themes to ponder on." Then to console the tired youth, he added, "But they cannot carve marble, and that is a language as eloquent as any." The next morning he reached the garden early. Agony sought him out in the workshed where he had set up his bearded old man to practice on. "I'm consumed by curiosity," cried Agony. "Tell me about life in the palace." Michelangelo told his friend of the room he shared with Bertoldo, how he had wandered down the long halls, free to handle the art treasures of the guests at the Sunday dinner and his exciting supper in Lorenzo's studiolo with the Platonists. Agony was interested only in personalities. What are Polizano and Pico della Mirandola like? Well, Polizano is ugly until he starts to speak, then his words make him beautiful. Pico della Mirandola is the best-looking man I've ever seen, and brilliant. "You're very impressionable," said Agony tartly. "A new pair of bright blue eyes, long wavy golden hair, and your eyes pop out of their sockets. But, Agony, think of being able to read and write in 22 languages, when we can barely express ourselves in one." "Speak for yourself," retorted Agony. "I have a nobleman's education, and I can discuss with the best of them. It is not my fault if you are ignorant." Michelangelo realized that his friend had become quarrelsome. "I meant no criticism of you, Agony. One night in the Medici palace and already the rest of Florence seems ignorant to you. I was merely—" "You were merely bragging about your new friends," interrupted Agony, "men who are so much more attractive and intelligent than your old, grubby friends with whom you have been imprisoned in these garden walls." "I had no such thought. Why do you say such things?" But Agony had turned away. Michelangelo sighed, returned to his marble. Palm Sunday was a warm spring day. On his washstand he found 3 gold florins which Bertoldo said would be left for him each week by Lorenzo's secretary, Ser Piero da Bibbiena. He could not resist the temptation of showing off to his family. On his bed he laid out another new outfit, the white blouse embroidered with grapes and leaves, the short surcoat with cape sleeves belted in front with silver buckles, the wine-colored stockings. He smiled to himself as he pictured Granex's expression when he met him in the Piazza San Marco so they could walk home together. Rustesi stared at him as he came down the path and, when Michelangelo was close enough, mimicked. "I'm plain." Then, more acidly, "Spread your tail." "My tail? All peacocks have colorful tails." "Oh, now, Rustesi," he wailed, "can't I wear them even once? Can't I wear this jewelry just once? Can't I drink this rare wine just once? Order these servants around just once? Squander some gold coins just once? Sleep with this pretty girl just once? All the temptations of the flesh in one sonnet. Truly, Rustesi, I feel as though I were dressed up in a costume for a pageant. But I would like to impress my family." "Via," growled Rustesi. "Go your way." Torrigiani came stalking down the path, his flame-colored cloak and orange plumes on his black velvet hat flying. He hauled up short in front of Michelangelo. "I want to talk to you, alone." Torrigiani seized his arm. Michelangelo held back. "Why alone? We have no secrets. We shared confidences. Until you moved into the palace and became so important." There was no mistaking the emotion behind Torrigiani's outburst. Michelangelo spoke gently, hoping to placate him. "But you live in your own palace, Torrigiani." "Yes, and I don't have to play cheap little tricks like knocking out a fawn's teeth to ingratiate myself with the Medici." "You sound jealous." "Of what?" "Of an insufferable prig." "Why a prig? What's the connection?" "Because you know nothing about happiness or comradeship." "I've never been happier." "Yes, setting down charcoal lines with your grimy hands." "But good charcoal lines," protested Michelangelo, refusing to take Torrigiani seriously. Torrigiani went purple in the face. "Are you implying that mine are not? Why do you always bring a discussion back to yourself? You're not the center of the universe." "To myself, I am. And I was to you too, until your head got swollen." Michelangelo stared at him in amazement. "You were never the center of my universe." "Then you deceived me. You're sucking up for your commissions an awful long time in advance." The sun went cold on Michelangelo's face. He turned and ran as hard as he could, out of the garden and down the street of the quarries makers. The carpenter and grocer sitting in the sun before their shops pulled at their caps respectfully, otherwise his new clothes were no more of a success at home than they had been with Rustesi. His father felt hurt, as though the finery was in some way a reproach to him. Michelangelo took the 3 gold florins from the purse on his belt and put them on Lodovico's desk. Lodovico gazed at them without comment, but his stepmother Lucrezia bussed him happily on both cheeks, her eyes bright with excitement. "Now tell me, what sauces do they use on the pasta?" Michelangelo racked his brains, wanting to please. "I can't remember." "Then the meats. Do the palace cooks use Savonarola? What of their famous sole cooked with banana strips and pine nuts?" "Forgive me, Madre mia, I don't know." She shook her head in despair. "Don't you remember what you chewed? Then make friends with the cooks. Write down the recipes for my sake." Now the full family had assembled in Lodovico's combination office and sitting room. His grandmother was happy because he was meeting the great men of Florence. His brother Giovansimone was interested in the parties. His aunt and uncle were pleased because of the gold coins he had brought home. Buonarrotti wanted to know about the business arrangement. Was he to receive 3 gold coins every week? Were the stone and materials taken out of his salary? His father called for attention. "How do the Medici treat you? Il Magnifico?" "Well, Piero. He is arrogant, it is his nature. Giovanni, the cardinal to be. He treats all alike, as though each meeting were the first. Giuliano. Michelangelo smiled. The whole palace loves him. Lodovico cogitated a moment, then announced. Piero's attitude will prevail. You are in the palace as a humble workman. He eyed the 3 gold coins gleaming on the desk. What are they? A gift? A wage? I am to have 3 florins each week. What did they say when they delivered the money? It was on my wash table. When I asked Bertoldo, he said that it was a weekly allowance. His uncle Francesco could not contain his delight. Splendid. With this steady money we can rent a stall. Michelangelo, you will be partner, you will share in the profits. Imagine, his Aunt Cassandra chimed in with a newborn respect, that Michelangelo should be the one to put us back in commerce. No. It was Lodovico, his face a deep red. We are not the bashful poor? But they were given to Michelangelo as a member of the Medici family, answered his young wife. Humph! Snorted Lodovico. What makes him a Medici? 3 gold coins? It is not charity. Michelangelo was indignant. I work from light to dark. Are you legally apprenticed? Did I sign a guild agreement? He turned on his brother Francesco. The gift is a whim. Next week there may be nothing. Michelangelo thought his father was going to throw the money at his head. He had meant only to bring home his earnings like a dutiful son, perhaps bragging a little. But the 3 gold florins were more than Lodovico would earn in months at the customs. Michelangelo realized that he had been indelicate, for now, with his head on his chest, Lodovico commented. Think how many millions of florins the Medici must have if they can give a 15-year-old student 3 of them each week. Then, with a quick movement of his hand, he swept them into the top drawer of his desk. Lucrezia seized the moment to summon them to table. After dinner the family reassembled in the sitting room. Leonardo, silent during the earlier discussion, placed himself in front of Michelangelo to proclaim in a pontifical voice. Art is a vice. Art, a vice. Michelangelo was amazed at his brother. How? Why? Because it is self-indulgence, concentration on your own lust to create instead of contemplating the glories of what God has created. But, Leonardo, our churches are plastered with art. We have been led astray by the devil. A church is not a fair. People must go to pray on their knees, not to see a play painted on the walls. Then there is no place for a sculptor in your world. Leonardo clasped his hands, gazing devoutly through the ceiling. My world is the next world, where we will sit at the right hand of God. Lodovico rose from his seat, exclaimed, Now I have 2 fanatics on my hands. He left for his midday coma followed by the rest of the family. Only Monna Alessandra remained sitting quietly in a corner. Michelangelo too wanted to leave, he was feeling tired. The whole day had been a disappointment. Leonardo would not let him go. He moved into a frontal attack on Lorenzo and the Plato Academy as pagans, atheists, enemies of the church, antichrists. I promise you, Leonardo, began Michelangelo placatingly, I have heard no sacrilege, irreverence, at least not to religion itself. Only to the abuses. Lorenzo is a reformer, he wants to cleanse the church. Cleanse. A word that infidels use when they mean destroy. An attack on the church is an attack on Christianity. Now in a high rage Leonardo accused Lorenzo de' Medici of carnality, debauchery, of leaving the palace at midnight to ride out with his cronies to nights of revelry and seduction of young women. Of these charges, I know nothing, said Michelangelo quietly, but he is a widower. Should he not love? He was a philanderer before the death of his wife. It is common knowledge. His lust has already enfeebled his body. He wondered how his brother came into possession of such charges. He did not think of Lorenzo as a saint. He had heard him say laughingly to Longino, "I do not err through wickedness, but rather through some part of my nature that loves pleasure," and he remembered Lorenzo's reply to Ficino, "I cannot regret that I love the pleasures of the flesh, for the love of painting, sculpture and literature is also sensual in nature." All this seemed to him to be the private affair of a virile, effective man. Only a toady like yourself would be unable to see that Lorenzo is a tyrant, continued Leonardo. Michelangelo thought, "This is the second time today I have been called a toady." He became increasingly miserable, his clothes felt tight and ridiculous. "He has destroyed the freedom of Florence," cried Leonardo. "He has made things soft and easy for the people. He gives them bread and circuses. The only reason he has failed to take a crown and become king is that he is too devious. He likes to work behind the scenes, controlling every move while the Tuscans are reduced to pawns." Before Michelangelo could reply, Monna Alessandra said, "Yes, Leonardo, he is softening us. He has kept us from civil war. For years we destroyed each other, family against family, neighborhood against neighborhood, with blood flowing in the streets. Now we are a unified people. Only the Medici can keep us from each other's throats." Leonardo refused to answer his grandmother. "Michelangelo, I wish one last word with you." Michelangelo faced his brother across a heavy mahogany table. He had never been able to talk to this strange boy, or enjoy any companionship with him. "This is my farewell to you. I leave the house tonight, to join Girolamo Savonarola in San Marco." "Then Savonarola has arrived?" Lorenzo invited him. "I was in the studio when Pico della Miranda suggested it, and Lorenzo agreed to write to Lombardy." A Medici lie. Why should Lorenzo summon him, when it is Savonarola's intention to destroy the Medici? "I leave this house as Francis Savonarola left his family in Ferrara, with only a shirt on my back. Forever. I shall pray for you on the floor of my cell until there is no skin left on my knees and the blood comes. Perhaps in that blood you can be redeemed." Michelangelo could see from Leonardo's burning eyes that there was no use in answering. He shook his head in mock despair, thought, "Father is right. How did this sane, sensible, money-changing Buonarroti family, who have had nothing but conformists for 200 years, hatch two fanatics in one generation?" He murmured to Leonardo, "We shall not be too far apart, only a few hundred feet across the Piazza San Marco. If you lean out the window of your monastery cell you will hear me cutting stone in the garden." The following week, when he again found 3 gold coins on his washstand, he decided not to take them home. He went looking for Contessina, found her in the library. "I must buy a gift." "For a lady?" "For a woman." "Jewels, perhaps." "No." Sullenly. "She is the mother of my friends, the stone cutters." "How about a linen tablecloth bordered with open work?" "They have a tablecloth." "Has she many dresses?" "The one she was married in." "A black dress for mass, then?" "Excellent." "How big is she?" He looked bewildered. "Draw me her picture." He grinned. "With a pen I know everything, even a woman's proportions. I will ask my nurse to take me to the shop to buy a length of black wool. My sarda will cut it to fit your drawing." "You are kind, Contessina." She wanted no gratitude. "It is nothing." He went to the outdoor market in the Piazza Santo Spirito and purchased gifts for the other Topolinos, then arranged with one of the grooms in the basement of the palace to borrow a horse and saddle-bag. Sunday morning after attending Mass in the palace chapel he packed the bag and set out for Settignano, with the sun burning warmly on his bare head. At first he had thought he would change to his old clothes so that the Topolinos would not think he was putting on airs, but quickly realized that this would be an affectation. Besides, he fancied himself in the dark blue shirt and hose which he was already wearing. The Topolinos were sitting on the terrace overlooking the valley and the Buonarrotti house on the ridge opposite, enjoying their weekly hour of idleness after returning from Mass in the little village church. They were so surprised to see him come riding up the road on a silver-gray stallion, sitting on a silver saddle, that they forgot to say hello. Michelangelo, too, was silent. He got down from the horse, tied him to a tree, took off the saddlebag and emptied it onto the rough board table. After a moment of silence the father asked what the packages were. Michelangelo replied, "Gifts." "Gifts?" The father gazed at his three sons in turn, for except to children, Tuscans do not give presents. "Are you late for the last Befana, or early for the next?" "Both. For 4 years I ate your bread and drank your wine." The father replied roughly, "You cut stone for your soup." "I took my first money home to the Buonarrotti. Today, for the Topolinos, I bring the second." "You have a commission?" cried the grandfather. "Number?" "Each week Lorenzo gives me spending money." The Topolinos scrutinized one another's faces. "Spending money?" asked the father. "You mean wages?" "I receive no wages." "Oh, it is keep money, for your room and food." "I do not pay for room and food." "It is purchase money?" "For your kells, or for marble?" "Everything is provided." "Then what is it for?" "To spend on whatever comes to mind." "If you have food, bed, marble, what would come to mind?" "Pleasure." "Pleasure?" The family rolled this word on their tongues as though it were a new fruit. "What manner of pleasure?" Michelangelo thought about that. "Well, gambling at seed cards, for example." "Do you gamble?" "No." "What else?" After a moment, "To be shaved in the straw market." "Do you have a beard?" "Not yet. But I could have oil put in my hair like Torrigianate does." "Do you want oil in your hair?" "No." "Then it is not a pleasure." "What other?" "In desperation, well, the women who wear a cowl with a bell on their heads when they walk on Saturday afternoons." "Do you want these women?" "I use it as an illustration. I could buy candles to burn before the Virgin." "That is a duty." "A glass of wine of a Sunday afternoon?" "That is a custom." He walked to the table. "It is to bring things to your friends." Slowly, amidst a deep silence, he began distributing his gifts. "To me a Madre, for Mass. For Bruno, a leather belt with silver buckle. For Gilberto, a yellow shirt and stockings. And Nonno, a wool scarf for your throat in winter. For Father Topolino, high boots for when you work in Cave Maiano. Enrico, you said that when you grew up you would own a gold ring. Eccolo." For a long moment they gazed at him, speechless. Then the mother went into the house to put on the dress, the father pulled on the high boots, Bruno clasped the belt about his waist, Gilberto donned the new gold shirt, the grandfather stood wrapping and unwrapping the soft wool scarf around his neck. Enrico mounted the horse, the better to admire his ring in privacy. Then the father spoke. "All of these gifts, they are from spending money?" "All." "And Lorenzo, he gives you this money to buy us gifts?" "Yes." "He is truly the magnificent one." Michelangelo noticed another package on the table. Perplexed, he opened it, pulled out a linen tablecloth. He remembered Contessina saying, "How about a linen tablecloth?" Contessina had put this gift in the saddlebag as her contribution. The color rose to his cheeks. Dio mio! How could he explain it? He thrust the cloth into the hands of Mother Topolino. "This is a gift from Contessina de' Medici. For you." The Topolinos were stupefied. "Contessina de' Medici? How would she send us a tablecloth? She does not know we live." "Yes, she does. I told her about you. Her Sarta sewed your dress." The nonno crossed himself. "It is a miracle." Michelangelo thought, "Amen. It is true." Each of the Plato four had his own villa in the country around Florence. They came in several times a week to lecture and work with Lorenzo in the studiolo. Lorenzo seemed eager that Michelangelo take advantage of these opportunities, and so he attended faithfully. The Platonists tried to interest him in Latin and Greek, working up charts to show him that the calligraphy of the two languages was a drawing similar in nature to his figure drawing. He took their manuscripts and assignments to his room, pored over them for hours, and learned little. "Nothing sticks," he wailed to Bertoldo. Stopped, the man taught him to read aloud, poetry in the Vulgate, Dante, Petrarch, Horace, Virgil. This he enjoyed, particularly the discussions that followed his reading of the Divine Comedy, with the interpretation of its philosophy. The Platonists complimented him on his growing clarity of diction, then brought in Girolamo Benivieni, whom they described as the most fervent partisan of poetry in the Vulgate, to teach Michelangelo how to write his own verse. When he demurred on the grounds that he wanted to become a sculptor, not a poet, Pico said, "The structure of a sonnet is as rigorous a discipline as the structure of a marble relief. When Benivieni teaches you to write sonnets, he trains your mind in the rules of logic and composition of thought. You simply must take advantage of his talent." Longino reassured him, "We will not try to weaken your carving arm by replacing hammer and chisel with pen and ink." Polizano added, "You must not give up studying poetry. You must continue to read aloud. To be a complete artist, it is not enough to be a painter, sculptor or architect. One must also be a poet, if one is to attain full expression." "I do so poorly," Michelangelo complained one night to Benivieni when he had tried to make the lines scan. "How can you bear to read my clumsy attempts?" Benivieni, also a talented musician, clucked at Michelangelo's despair, sang a gay song of his own composition, then replied, "My early efforts were no better, worse, if anything. You will think you are a bad poet until the day comes when you have a need to express something, then you'll have the tools of poetry at hand, meter and rhyme, just as you have hammer and chisel on your workbench." On religious holidays, when Lorenzo closed the garden, Michelangelo would ride horseback to Longino's villa on the hill in the Casentino, which had been given to him by the Florentine Republic for his commentaries on Dante, to Ficino's villa at Cergi, a castle with battlements and covered galleries, to Pico's the Corpolizano's Villa Diana, both on the slopes of Fesole. At the Villa Diana they would settle down in a garden pavilion like the one in which the characters from Boccaccio's Decameron spun their tales, and listen to Polizano read his newest poem. "Come where green the grass is. Green the trees are turning. Have no fear, fair lasses. Every lad is yearning. Beasts and birds are burning. All with love they may. Youth's a brittle jewel. Grass again is greening. Age knows no renewal. Fair ones, be not cruel. To your loves they may." An idea began to shape in Michelangelo's mind. He too would one day have a house like the Villa Diana, with a sculpture workshop and an annual stipend from Lorenzo which would enable him to buy Carrara marbles from which to carve great statues. Was there any reason why he should not be so treated? He was in no hurry, but when Lorenzo did give him one he would like it to be in Settignano, among stone carvers. The days and the weeks passed, drawing from lived models, transferring the figures to clay, experimenting with scraps of stone to bring forth a knee joint, a hip movement, the turn of a head on its neck, learning how to avoid a welt when the point of his punch broke, studying Lorenzo's Greek sculptures for techniques. Lorenzo also pushed his education. One Sunday morning he asked Michelangelo to accompany the Medici family to the church of San Gallo, where they would hear Francis Mariano, to whose cloister Lorenzo went when he wanted a serious discussion on theology. "Francis Mariano is my ideal," said Lorenzo. "He has graceful austerity, elegant asceticism, and the liberal religion of enlightened common sense. You will hear." Francis Mariano preached in a mellow voice, harmonious cadences and apartment words. He complimented Christianity on its resemblance to Platonism, quoted from the Greeks, declaimed lines from the Latin poets with polished eloquence. Michelangelo was captivated. He had not heard this manner of priest before. When Francis Mariano modulated his voice, he was charmed. When Mariano unfolded his argument, he was convinced. When Mariano illustrated with a funny anecdote, he smiled. When he pressed with serious truths, he yielded to their force. To Lorenzo he said, "I understand better now what the Academy means by modern religion." One of Piero's grooms knocked on the door of his apartment and entered. "His Excellency, Piero de' Medici, commands Michelangelo Buonarrotti to present himself in His Excellency's anteroom at the hour before sunset." Michelangelo thought, how different from his father, who asks if it would give me pleasure to join him. To the groom he replied courteously, "Inform His Excellency that I shall be present." There was ample time for a soak in a round wooden tub in the bathing closet at the end of the hall, sitting with his knees clasped under his chin, wondering what the crown prince of the Medici dynasty, who had never favored him with anything more than a formal bow, could want of him. Some instinct told him that his peacock outfit of embroidered shirt and violet cloak was precisely what Piero would approve. Piero's suite was on the first floor of the palace, just over the open loggia and the corner of the Via d'Agori and Via Larga. Michelangelo had never been in the swing of the palace, not even to see the artworks he had heard discussed, because of Piero's coolness. Now his feet dragged along the corridor leading to Piero's suite, for on the walls there was a brilliant painting by Francis Angelico and a delicate marble relief by Desiderio di Settignano. The groom was waiting outside Piero's anteroom. He admitted Michelangelo. Madonna Alfonsina, Piero's wife, gowned in grey damask embroidered with jewels, was sitting motionless in a high-backed purple throne chair. Covering the wall behind was a tapestry of leaves and flowers, and on the wall to her left, a large oil portrait of her, the cheeks a pale alabaster. Piero pretended he had not heard Michelangelo enter. He stood on a multicolored Persian carpet with his back to his guest, studying a bone tabernacle with glass panels, inside which were painted stories of Christ. Alfonsina stared at Michelangelo imperiously, giving no sign of recognition but sniffing slightly as she always did, as though Florence and the Florentines smelled bad. She had from the beginning made no attempt to conceal her contempt for the Florentines. To the Tuscans, who had hated Rome and everything Roman for centuries, this was infuriating. And Piero de' Medici, half Orsini by inheritance, was now having the other half of his heritage usurped by the second Orsini. Piero wheeled around, his long thick hair waving down to his shoulders, the face handsome despite the askew cleft in the chin. Without any formal greeting he announced, "We instruct you, Michelangelo Buonarrotti, that we wish Madonna Alfonsina's portrait sculptured in marble." "Thank you, Excellency," replied Michelangelo, "but I cannot carve portraits." "Why not?" Michelangelo attempted to explain that his purpose was not to create any one person. "I could not capture a likeness, as this painter has, that would satisfy you. Model. I order you to carve my wife in marble." Michelangelo gazed at Piero's contemptuous expression, heard his father's voice saying, "What is it, to be a stone-cutter in the Medici palace? The same as a groom." Madonna Alfonsina spoke for the first time. "Kindly remove this discussion to your own room." Piero angrily opened the door and stalked through. Michelangelo surmised that he had best follow. He closed the door behind him and was surprised to find that, among Piero's silver prizes of helmets and cups won in tournaments, were many fine works of art: Botticelli's Pallas, Bertolto's Bellerophon, and Initz's ancient painted wood sculptures against a golden ground. Involuntarily he exclaimed, "Your Excellency has superb taste in the arts." Piero was not propitiated. "When I want your opinion I will ask for it. In the meanwhile you will explain why you think you are better than any other of our hirelings." Michelangelo clenched his anger with his back teeth, forcing himself to reply politely. "I am a sculptor, resident in this palace at your father's request. We have 100 tradesmen living off this palace. What they are told to do, they do. You will commence tomorrow morning. And see that you make Her Excellency into a beautiful statue. Not even Mino da Fasola could do that." Piero's eyes flashed. You, contadino. Pack your rags and get out of our presence." Michelangelo went to his room, began throwing clothing from the chest onto the bed. There was a knock. Contessina entered with her nurse. "I hear you have been feuding with my brother." He leaned down to take something from the bottom of the chest. "Stand up here and talk to me." Imperiously. He rose, went close to her. "I have nothing to say. Is it true that you refused to carve Alfonsina's portrait?" "I refused." "Would you refuse if my father asked you to do his portrait?" Michelangelo was silent. Would he refuse Lorenzo, for whom he felt so deep an affection? "Would you refuse if I asked?" Again he was trapped. "Piero did not ask me," he replied quietly. "He ordered me." There were hurried footsteps in the corridor. Lorenzo came into the room, his skin unusually dark, his eyes snapping. The nurse stammered, "Excellency." I tried to stop her. Lorenzo waved her away. "I will not have this happen in my home." Michelangelo's eyes blazed. "I asked your father to cede you to me, did I not?" "Yes." "Then I am responsible for you. I have no apologies to offer." "I am not asking for apologies. You came in here as one of the family. No one will treat you as an entertainer, or order you out of your own home." Michelangelo's knees went weak. He sat down on his bed. Lorenzo spoke more gently. "But you, too, have much to learn." "Admitted." "My manners. That you do not rush back here every time you are offended, and start packing your possessions. That is poor loyalty to me. Is that understood?" Michelangelo rose, trying to hold back the tears. "I owe Piero an apology. I said something unkind about his wife. He owes you one. What you wish to say to him in return is your own business." Contessina lagged behind to whisper over her shoulder, "Make it up with Piero. He can cause a lot of trouble." The time had arrived to try a theme. What was a theme? And which themes interested him? It must be a Greek theme, decreed Plato for. It should come out of the legends, Hercules and Dentius, the Battle of Amazons, the Trojan War, proffered Plesano, with particles of cantaloupe clinging to his enormous dark lips. It would be in the mood of the frieze on the Parthenon at Athens. Michelangelo said, "But I know little of such matters." Longino, his face grave, replied, "That, my dear Michelangelo, is what we have been trying to suggest for the past months, that as your ex officio tutors we teach you about the Greek world and its culture." Pico della Mirandola laughed, and the studiolo was filled with the music of violas and clavichords. "What I think our friends are trying to say is that they would like to guide you back to the golden age of paganism." They told him stories of the 12 tasks of Hercules, Niobe suffering for her dying children, of the Athenian Minerva, the dying gladiator. Lorenzo moderated the discussion in his slightly unpleasant voice. "Do not issue edicts to our young friend. He must come to a theme of his own free will." Michelangelo pulled back into his seat and sat with his head resting on the back of the chair, his eyes gleaming amber in the candlelight that brought whirls of red to his chestnut hair. He listened to his own voices. One thing he knew for certain: his first theme could not come from Athens or Cairo or Rome or even Florence. It had to come from him, something he knew and felt and understood. Otherwise he would be lost. A work of art was not like a work of scholarship, it was personal, subjective. It had to be born within. Lorenzo had asked, "What do you want to say?" To himself he replied, "Something simple, about which I can feel deeply. But what do I know? Even about myself? That I want to become a sculptor, and that I love marble? I can carve no sculpture out of these sentiments." Then, against the murmur of voices, he saw himself standing on the steps of the Rucellai chapel the day he had first gone with the Galateo studio to Santa Maria Novella. He saw the chapel vividly before him, the Cimabue and Nino Pisano Madonnas, and felt again his love for his mother, his sense of loss when she was gone, his aloneness, the hunger for love. It had grown late. The meeting broke up. Lorenzo remained. Though at times his tongue was said to have a rough edge, he spoke with naturalness and clarity. "You must forgive our Platonists their enthusiasm," he said. "Ficino burns a lamp before Plato's bust. Longino gives the finest literary banquet of the year on Plato's anniversary. For us, Plato and the Greeks are the key that has let us escape from a dungeon of religious prejudices. We are trying to establish here in Florence another age of Pericles. In the light of our ambition, you must understand the excesses of our zeal." "If you are not tired, Lorenzo," said Michelangelo, "could we make a little tour of the palace and look at the Madonnas and Child?" Lorenzo took up the highly polished bronze lamp. They went down the corridor until they came to the anteroom of Lorenzo's office, in which there was a Donatello marble relief, so remote and impersonal, Michelangelo thought, as to prevent identification. From here they went to Giuliano's bedroom. The youngest Medici continued to sleep, the covers pulled up over his face, while Michelangelo and Lorenzo discussed Pasolino's Madonna and Child with 2 little angels, painted on a wooden table. They trod the corridors examining the Francis Filippo Lippi Virgin adoring Child on the altar of the chapel, about which Lorenzo explained that the models were the nun, Lucrezia Botti, with whom Francis Filippo had fallen in love, and the child of their mating, Filippino Lippi, now a painter who had been trained by Botticelli, even as Botticelli had been trained by Francis Filippo. They examined the Neridi by Madonna, then went on to Luca della Robbia's Madonna and Child with the Medici crest, all in high glowing color, and finally to Lorenzo's bedroom to see the Botticelli Madonna of the Magnificat, painted for Lorenzo's father and mother some 20 years before. "Those 2 angels kneeling before the Virgin and Child are my brother Giuliano and myself. When the Pazzi murdered him, the brightest light went out of my life. The portrait of me is an idealization, as you can see. I am a homely man, and not ashamed of it, but all painters think I want to be flattered. Benozzo Gozzoli did so in our chapel, as well. They make my dark skin light, my turned-up nose straight, my scraggly hair as beautiful as Pico's." Lorenzo shot him a piercing look, lips compressed, brow stern. "You appear to know I don't need flattery." "Granexi says I'm crusty," said Michelangelo, embarrassed. "You are armed and adamant," declared Lorenzo. "Stay that way." Lorenzo told him the legend of Simonetta Vespasi, original of Botticelli's Madonna of the Magnificat, "the purest beauty Europe has known," said Lorenzo. "It is not true that Simonetta was my brother Giuliano's mistress. He was in love with her, as was all Florence, but platonically. He wrote long sentimental poems to her, but had my nephew Giulio by his real mistress, Antonia Gorini. It was Sandro Botticelli who truly loved Simonetta, though I doubt if he ever spoke to her in person. She is the woman in all his paintings, Primavera, Venus, Pallas. No man has ever painted such exquisite female beauty." Michelangelo was silent. When he thought of his mother he saw her too as a beautiful young woman, yet it was a different beauty he felt, one coming from within. Not a woman desirable to all men, as was Botticelli's love, but one who would love a son and be loved by him. He turned his face up to Lorenzo, speaking in full confidence. "I feel close to the Madonna. She is the only image I have of my mother. Since I still have to search for my technique, wouldn't it be best to know what I'm trying to say?" "It could be best," replied Lorenzo gravely. "Perhaps what I feel about my mother will be true of what she felt about me." He haunted the rooms of the palace, drawing after the masters, sometimes with Contessina or Giuliano keeping him company. Then he grew impatient with other men's ideas and went into the poorer parts of town where the women worked on the sidewalks before their houses, weaving cane chair seats or demi-john covers, with their babes on their laps or at the breast. He went into the countryside to the contadini around Settignano who had known him since he was a child, and who gave no second thought to his drawing them while they bathed or cycled their young. He was not looking for portraiture but for the spirit of motherhood. He drew the mother and child in every position he found, seeing the true relation between them through his charcoal and paper, and then, for a few scudi, persuaded the woman to move, change, shift themselves and the child to give him more angles of approach, to search for he knew not what. With Granexi, toward Agony, Sansovino and Rusticci he went out to the art of Florence, drawing concentratedly on the Madonna and child theme, listening to Bertoldo dissect each piece as they spent their hours trying to learn how their predecessors had achieved their results. The Bernardo Rossellino in his home church of Santa Croce, Michelangelo found to be a fat expressionless mother and child, and in the same church a Desiderio di Settignano, a contadina and bambina wrapped in Tuscan swaddling clothes, ordinary folk in from the country for a festa. They went to Orsanmichele to see the Orcagna Virgin of the Nativity, which was tender and loving and had power, but to Michelangelo seemed primitive and wooden. The freestanding Nino Pisano in Santa Maria Novella appeared to be the best carved, but the well-groomed peasant merchant's wife holding her expensively clothed earthling son was poorly proportioned and without spirituality. A Verrocchio terracotta Virgin and Child presented a middle-aged Madonna gazing in perplexity at this son who was already standing up and blessing the world. On they moved to Agostino di Dascio's Virgin and Child, richly garbed young elegants with blank coy faces. The next morning he went for a walk alone up the Arno toward Pontassieve. The sun was biting hot. He took off his shirt, exposing his chest to its germinal heat. The blue Tuscan hills blurred and faded back in serried ranges. He loved these mountains. Striking off into the hills, with the feel of the steep slope under him, he realized that he had not yet come to grips with what he wanted to convey about Mary and her child. He knew only that he wanted to attain something fresh and vital. He fell to musing about the character and fate of Mary. The Annunciation was a favorite theme of Florentine painters. The Archangel Gabriel come down from heaven to announce to Mary that she was to bear the Son of God. In all the paintings he remembered, the news seemed to come to her as a complete surprise, and apparently she had been given no choice. But could that be? Could so important a task, the most important assigned to any human since Moses, have been forced on Mary without her knowledge or consent? Surely God must have loved Mary above all women on earth to choose her for this divine task. Must he not have told her the plan, related every step of the way from Bethlehem to Calvary? And in his wisdom and mercy have allowed her the opportunity to reject it? And if Mary did have freedom of choice, when would she be likely to exercise it? At the Annunciation? When she had borne her child? At a moment of suckling, while Jesus was still an infant? Once she accepted, must she not carry her burden from that moment until the day that her child was crucified? Knowing the future, how could she subject her son to such agony? Might she not have said, "No, not my son. I will not consent. I will not let it happen"? But could she go against the wish of God? When he had appealed to her to help him, was ever mortal woman cast in so pain-fraught a dilemma? He decided that he would carve Mary at the moment of decision, while suckling her infant, when, knowing all, she must determine the future, for herself, for her child, for the world. Now that he understood what he was about, he was able to draw with a purpose. Mary would dominate the marble. She would be the center of the composition. She would be heroic in stature, a woman not only given the freedom to come to her own decision but with the inner force and intelligence to make it. The child would be secondary, present, vitally alive, but in no way distracting. He would place the child on his mother's lap, his face buried in his mother's breast, but his back fully turned on his viewers. This would give the child his natural place, caught at the most urgent activity of his day, and by the same symbolism this could be the moment when Mary would feel most urgently that her decision had to be made. As far as he knew, no one had sculptured or painted Jesus with his back turned. Yet his drama would not be begun for some 30 years. This was the mother's time, and the mother's portrait. He reviewed the hundreds of sketches of mother and child he had made in the past months, extracting those that would fit his new concept, and with the sketches on a table before him began his search for the background of the theme. Where was Mary at the time? Here was a drawing showing a mother sitting on a bench at the bottom of a flight of stairs. Who besides her child was with her? Here were any number of young children in attitudes of play. The figure of Mary could be a composite of these strong Tuscan mothers. But how did one portray the face of the Madonna? His memory of his own mother's appearance was nearly 10 years old now, and had a vague dreamlike quality. He put the drawings aside. Was it possible to conceive a piece of sculpture without knowing the marble from which it would draw its sustenance? He sought out Granici, who had been given one of the largest rooms in the casino as his painting studio, and asked if they could visit the stone shops of the city. "I'll work better if I have the marble at hand so I can see and feel it, and learn about its inner structure." Bertoldo says marble shouldn't be bought until the drawings and models are completed, then you can be sure you will choose an adequate block. "It could work the other way round," he answered thoughtfully. "I think it's a kind of wedding." "All right, I'll tell Bertoldo some fancy yarn, and we'll go tomorrow." Florence had dozens of stone stores scattered through the proconsul section, with all sizes and shapes of granite, travertine, colored marbles, as well as ready-cut building stones, door frames, window seats, columns. But they failed to turn up the Carrara block for which Michelangelo was searching. "Let's walk up to the Settignano yards. We'll have a better chance there," he suggested. In the old yard where Desiderio had trained Mino da Fesol, he saw a piece that captivated him at once. It was of modest size, but its crystals were gleaming white. He poured water on it to look for cracks, struck its sands with a hammer to listen for its sounds, tested for flaws, bubbles, stains. "This is the one, Granexite," he cried with glee. "It will hold the Madonna and Child. But I'll have to see it by the first rays of sunlight. Then I'll know for sure it's perfect. If you think I'm going to sit on the ground worshipping your marble until dawn. No, you settle the price. I'll borrow a horse from the Topolinos for you so you reach home alive. You know, amico, I don't believe a word of this sunrise tells all nonsense. What can you conceivably see at sunrise that you don't see better right now in a strong light? I think it's a kind of pagan worship, fertility rites you have to perform at dawn to make sure the gods of the mountains are propitiated." Michelangelo slept on a blanket under the Topolino arches, left before the first morning light, and was standing over his marble when the fingers of dawn came over the hills. The block was as though translucent. His eyes could pierce through its width and height and breadth, through the built-up layers of crystals compounded within its structural unity. There was no perceptible flaw, no crack or hollow, no discoloration, the crystals nickering brilliantly on its surface. "You are a noble block," he said aloud. He paid the owner Granexite gold coins, loaded the marble onto the Topolino cart and rode off behind a pair of undulating white accents as he had ridden from the cave Maiano since he was 6. He drove down the hill, turned right at Varlongo, went along the shore of the Africo River, past the ancient Porta alla Croce marking the fourth limit of the city, along the Borgo la Croce, past the hospital of Santa Maria Nuova, turned right at Val Larga in front of the Medici Palace, through the Piazza San Marco to the garden gate, as proud as though he were carrying home his bride. 2 of the stonemasons helped take the block to the shed. He then moved his drawing table and working equipment from the casino. Bertoldo came to the back of the garden, puzzled. "You are ready to begin carving?" "Number. I'm a long way yet." "Then why move from the casino?" "Because I would like to work in quiet." "Quiet? You won't be out of sound of those hammers of the Scalpellini all day." "That is a good sound. I was raised with it. But I must spend some time at the casino with the others. If you're near me, I can suggest and correct when you need help." Michelangelo thought for a moment, then said, "Bertoldo, I feel the need to be solitary, to work beyond all eyes, even yours. I could have instruction when I came to ask." Bertoldo's lips trembled. "You will make more mistakes that way, Carl, and continue in them longer. Isn't that the best way to learn? To carry one's mistakes to their logical conclusion? A word of advice can save you time." "I have time." Bertoldo withdrew behind his tired pale eyes. Then he smiled. "Davvero? You have time. When you want help, come to me." Late that afternoon, when the others had left the garden, Michelangelo turned to find Torrigini glaring at him. "Now you're too good even to draw next to me." "Oh, Torrigini. It's just that I want a little privacy." "Privacy? From me? Your best friend? You didn't want privacy that first year while you needed help and company. Now that Il Magnifico has selected you. Torrigini, please believe me, nothing has changed. I've only moved 150 feet. It's the same as moving 50 miles. I told you that when you were ready I would set up a sculptor's bench next to mine. I want to make my mistakes by myself. Or is it that you're afraid we'll steal your secrets?" "Secrets?" Michelangelo was growing angry. "What secrets can a beginning carver have? This is my first theme. You've already done half a dozen. Torrigine insisted, it's me you're rejecting. Michelangelo fell silent. Was there an element of truth in the accusation? He had admired Torrigine's physical beauty, stories, songs. But he no longer wanted to talk and listen to anecdotes with the block of marble standing challengingly by. You spoiled fast, declared Torrigine. I've been patronized before. But the ones who do it always come a cropper. A few minutes later Ecstasy arrived, looking jerk. He inspected the anvil, rough board table on horses, workbenches and drawing desk on a platform raised off the ground. What's wrong, Ecstasy? It's Torrigine. He came back to the casino in a black funk. Said some unpleasant things about you. I heard them first. Look, Michelangelo, I'm now on the other side of the calcio field. A year ago I warned you against paying too much attention to Torrigine. Now I have to warn you that you're not being fair. Don't cut him off. I know of your growing preoccupation with marble, but Torrigine doesn't see anything so magical about marble, and quite justifiably thinks it results from your life in the palace. If we threw over our friends because we grew fatigued with them, how many of our friendships would last? Michelangelo ran his thumb in a silhouetting line over the block. I'll try to make it up to him. Marble was derived from the Greek word meaning shining stone. How his block glistened in the early morning sunlight as he set it up vertically on the wooden bench, gazing at the luster produced by the light penetrating a short way and being reflected at the surfaces of the deeper lying crystals. He had lived with this block for several months now, studied it in every light, from every angle, in every degree of heat and cold. He had slowly come to understand its nature, not by cutting into it with a chisel but by force of perception, until he believed he knew every layer, every crystal, and precisely how the marble could be persuaded to yield the forms he needed. Bertoldo said that the forms had first to be released before they could be exalted. Yet the marble contained a myriad of forms. Had this not been so, all sculptors would carve identically. He picked up his hammer and subbia and began cutting with the colpo vivo, the live blow, his passage handled in one go, the chisel continuing in an uninterrupted direction as he used the point, a finger that dug delicately into the marble and threw out substance, the toothed chisel, a hand that refined the textures left by the point, the flat chisel, which was as a fist, knocking down the grooves of the toothed chisel. He had been right about this marble block. It obeyed every sensitivity he hoped to impart to it as he worked downward toward his figures through the successive layers. The marble turned light into the dark unexplored corners of his mind, opening him up to the seeds of new conceptions. He was not working from his drawings or clay models, they had all been put away. He was carving from the images in his mind. His eyes and hands knew where every line, curve, mass must emerge, and at what depth in the heart of the stone to create the low relief, for only a quarter of the figure would emerge. He was at work in his shed when he received a visit from Giovanni, the first time the 15-year-old near Cardinal had come to see him since he had been brought to the garden by Contessina a year before. In spite of the fact that he was totally unblessed with looks, Michelangelo found his expression intelligent and alert. Florence said that the easy-going, pleasure-loving second son of Lorenzo had ability but that he would never use it because the obsession of his life was to avoid trouble. He was flanked by his saturnine shadow, his 15-year-old cousin Giulio, in whom nature had undertaken the task of creating Giovanni's opposite, tall, spare, with an angular face, straight nose and cleft chin, arched dark eyebrows, large eyes, handsome, graceful, efficient, loving rebel as his natural meteor, but as cold and hard as a corpse. Recognized as a Medici by Lorenzo, but despised by Piero and Alfonsino because of his illegitimacy, Giulio could make a place for himself only through one of his cousins. He had attached himself to fat, good-natured Giovanni and had craftily insinuated himself into the position where he did all of Giovanni's work, took of his unpleasantnesses, provided his pleasures and made decisions as Giovanni would have wanted them. When Giovanni became a full cardinal and moved to Rome, Giulio would accompany him. "Giovanni, how kind of you to visit," said Michelangelo. "It's not really a visit," replied Giovanni in his plump voice. "I came to invite you to join my big hunt. It is the most exciting day of the year for the whole palace." Michelangelo had heard about the hunt, how Lorenzo's hunters, horsemen and grooms had been sent to a spot in the mountains which abounded with hares and porcupines, stags and wild boar, how the entire area had been enclosed by sailcloth and was guarded by the contadini of the neighborhood to keep the stags from jumping the cloth fence or the boars from tearing holes through it, which would let out the sea of game. He had never seen the phlegmatic Giovanni so buoyed with enthusiasm. "Forgive me, but as you can see I am in the marble, and I cannot leave off." Giovanni looked crestfallen. "You are not a laborer. You can work when you wish. You are free." Michelangelo clenched and unclenched his fist around the chisel which he had shaped octagonally so that it would not slip in his fingers. "That is debatable, Giovanni. But who would hold you?" "Me." "You would really prefer your work to my hunt?" "Since you give me a choice, yes." "How very odd. I wouldn't have believed it. You want only to work? You have no room for diversion?" That word was a stickler to Michelangelo, even as the word pleasure had been to the Topolinos. He wiped the matted marble dust off his perspiring upper lip. "Doesn't everyone have his own definition of diversion? For me, marble has the excitement of the hunt." Giulio said in an undertone to his cousin, "May we be spared from zealots." In his first sentence directed to Giulio, Michelangelo asked, "Why am I a zealot?" Giovanni replied, "Because you are interested to only one thing." Giulio spoke again in an undertone to Giovanni. Giovanni replied, "You are entirely right," and the two young men moved off without a further word. Michelangelo returned to his carving, the incident going out of his mind. But not for long. In the cool of dusk Contassina entered the garden. Coming close to Michelangelo's marble and speaking softly, she said, "My brother Giovanni says you frighten him." "Frighten him? But I haven't done anything." "Giovanni says you have a kind of ferociousness. Tell your brother not to despair of me. Perhaps I am too young to be broken to pleasure." Contassina threw him a searching look. "Giovanni's hunt is his supreme effort of the year. For those few hours he is the head of the Medici family, and even my father takes orders from him. If you reject his hunt it is as though you are rejecting Giovanni, setting yourself up as superior to him. He is kind, he never wants to hurt anyone. Why should you want to hurt him?" "I don't want to hurt him, Contassina. It's just that I don't want to break the mood. I want to carve all day and every day until I'm finished." She cried, "You've already made an enemy of Piero. Must you do the same to Giovanni?" He could think of nothing to answer. Then, the mood broken, he put down his three-toothed chisel, dampened a large white cloth in water at the fountain, covered his piece. The day would come when he would let no one stop him at his work. "All right, Contassina. I'll go." For a rhythmical movement he had learned to pick up hammer and chisel at the same instant, the point held loosely so that it could move freely without restricting the hammer force, his thumb curling over the tool and holding it by his forefingers, automatically shutting his eyes against chips at the moment of the impact. Working in low relief, He could cut away but little, and had to chain the physical force within himself. His point entered the marble at a near perpendicular angle, but as he approached the forms with the highest projections, the Madonna's face and the back of Jesus, he had to change his position. There were so many things to think of at one time. His strokes had to hit toward the main mass, strike the marble toward the block it came out of, so that it could sustain a blow. He had designed his figures and stairs in a vertical position to lessen the possibility of cracking the block, but found that the marble would not yield to exterior force without accenting its own essence, stoniness. He had not realized to what extent marble had to be battled. His respect for his material grew blow by blow. Bringing out the live figures involved long hours and longer days, a slow peeling off, layer by layer. Nor could the birth of substance be hastened. After each series of blows he stepped back to inspect his progress. On the left-hand side of his design there descended a flight of heavy stone steps. Mary was seated in profile on a bench to the right, the broad stone balustrade giving the illusion of ending in her lap, just under her child's knee. He saw that if Mary's strong left hand, holding the child's legs securely, were to open more widely, be moved out a little on a flat plane, it could be holding firmly not only her son but also the bottom of the balustrade, which would become an upright beam. Mary would then be supporting on her lap both the weight of Jesus and, if she made the choice to serve God as he had asked, the cross on which her son would be crucified. He would not force the symbolism on the viewer, yet it would be there for anyone to see who might feel it. Now he had the upright, but where was the transverse bar? He studied his drawings to find a way to complete the imagery. He looked at the boy, John, playing on top of the steps. If he threw the plum palm across the balustrade at right angle. He drew a fresh charcoal sketch, then began digging deeper into the crystalline flesh of the marble. Slowly, as he penetrated the block, the boy's body and right arm formed a living, pulsating crossbeam. As it should have, since John was to baptize his cousin Jesus and become an integral part of the Passion. With the carving of images of two other small children playing above the staffs, his Madonna and Child was finished. He began under Bertolto's rigorous instruction the one task in which he had no training, polishing. Bertolto hammered into him the evils of overlicking, which rendered a piece sweetly sentimental. Since he had worked the block on the south wall of his shed, he now asked Bugardini to help him stand the 13x18-inch plaque against the west wall so that he could polish it in the indirect north light. First he used a rasp to bring down the rough surfaces, then he washed away the fine marble dust. He found holes which Bertolto explained had been made at an early stage of his work when the chisel had penetrated too deeply, mashing crystals beneath the surface. Use a fine-grained emery stone with water, Bertolto instructed, but with a light hand. This accomplished, he once again washed his block with water. Now his work had a tactile quality similar to that of matte paper. Next he used lightweight pumice stones to refine the surface and expose fresh, sparkling crystals, running his fingers over the surface to feel the new silk-like texture. When he found himself needing better lighting to observe the subtle surface changes, he took down the planks of the north and east walls. In the new intense light the values changed. He felt obliged to wash down the carving, sponge it, let it dry. Start all over with emery stone and pumice. Slowly the highlights emerged, sunlight on the Madonna's face, on the curls, left cheek and shoulder of the Child. On the foredrapery covering the Madonna's leg, on the back of John as he straddled the balustrade, on the inside of the balustrade itself to accent its importance in the structure. All the rest, the block seat, stairs, walls were in quiet shadow. Now, he thought, one saw and felt the crisis, The intense emotional thinking reflected on Mary's face as she felt a tug of Jesus at her breast and the weight of the cross in her hand. Lorenzo summoned the Plato Four. When Michelangelo entered the room with Bertoldo, they found that the block had been mounted on a high flat altar covered with black velvet. The Plato group was hilarious. "You have carved a Greek figure, after all," cried Polizano exultantly. Pico said with an intensity unusual for him, "When I look at your carving I am outside Christianity. Your heroic figure has the impenetrable divinity of ancient Greek art." "I agree," added white-haired Longino, "the carving has a tranquility, a beauty and superhuman aspect that can only be described as Attic." "But why should it be?" asked Michelangelo numbly. "Why? Because you fell right off the Acropolis into Florence," exclaimed Ficino. "You're pagan at heart, the same as we are." "Magnifico, could we have that ancient stele brought from your office, the seated woman on a grave relief?" Within a matter of moments the palace groom had brought to the studio not only the ancient stele but several of the more portable Madonnas and Child, with which the Platonists attempted to prove that Michelangelo's carving bore no relationship to Christian carvings. "It was not supposed to," he replied a little heatedly. "I set out to create something original." Lorenzo had been enjoying the scene. Michelangelo has achieved a synthesis. His work is both Greek and Christian, beautifully fused, presenting the best of both philosophies. That should be particularly apparent to you who have spent your lives trying to achieve a unity of Plato and Christ. Michelangelo thought not one word have they said about Mary and her moment of decision. Is the meaning buried too deep? Or is that the part they find Greek? Because the child is not yet committed. Bertoldo, who had remained silent, growled, "Allora, let us speak of sculpture. Is it good? Is it bad?" Michelangelo was ignored as though he were not in the room. He gathered that they liked his first major work because they considered it a child of humanism. They were delighted at the revolutionary idea of the Christ child with his back toward the viewer, of Mary's noble knowledgeability. They were enthusiastic about his achievement in perspective, which was just beginning to be understood in marble. Not even Donatello had attempted it in his Madonnas, being content to suggest that angels and cherubs were vaguely behind the main figures. They were impressed with the projecting power of the three main figures, bursting with tension, one of the most vital reliefs they had seen. There were also things they did not like. They told him without mincing words that they found the Madonna's face to be overstylized, her superabundance of draperies diverting. The figure of the child was too muscular, the position of its arm and hand awkward, the figure of John so oversized as to be brutalized. Lorenzo cried, "Stop, stop, our young friend has worked a half a year on this project." "And thought it through entirely by himself," interjected Bertoldo. "Any help I gave was purely academic." Michelangelo stood up to draw their attention. "First, I hate draperies, I want to work only in the nude, and I simply fail to control them. As for the Madonna's face, I could never find it. In my own mind, I mean, and that is why I could never draw or carve it with more reality. But I would like to tell you, now that it is finished, what I hope to accomplish." "The room is full of ears," quipped Polizano. "I wanted the figures to be real and believable so that you would feel that with their very next breath would begin life itself." Then, shyly, he explained his thinking about Mary and her child, and her moment of decision. Lorenzo and the Plato Four fell silent, studying the marble. He felt them searching, pondering. Then, slowly, one by one, they turned back to him. Pride was in their eyes. When he returned to his apartment he found a leather pouch on his washstand. It was filled with bright gold florins, just how many he could not imagine. "What is this?" he asked Bertoldo. A purse from Lorenzo. Michelangelo picked up the pouch and walked to the staircase adjoining the apartment, up to the first floor and down the corridor to Lorenzo's bedroom. Lorenzo was sitting at a small table, before an oil lamp, writing letters. He turned in his chair as his valet announced Michelangelo. "Lorenzo, I can't understand why." "Gently, gently. Sit down here. Now, start at the beginning." Michelangelo gulped, quieted himself. "It's this purse of money. You should not have to buy the marble. It is yours already. I've lived in the palace while carving it, you've given me everything. I was not buying the piece, Michelangelo. It belongs to you. The purse is a kind of completion prize, similar to the one I gave Giovanni when he completed his ecclesiastical studies at Pisa. I thought you might like to travel and see other artworks. North through Bologna, Ferrara and Padua to Venice. South through Siena to Rome and Naples. I will give you letters of introduction." Despite the lateness of the hour, Michelangelo rushed home to the Via de Bentecordi. Everyone was asleep, but they quickly gathered in the family room, each carrying a candle, their nightcaps askew. Michelangelo spilled out the golden coins in a dramatic sweep across his father's desk. "But, what? Lodovico stumbled. "My prize money. For completing the Madonna and Child." "It's a lot," exclaimed his uncle. "How much?" "I haven't stopped to count," replied Michelangelo loftily. 30, 40, 50, counted his father. "Enough to support a family in these for half a year." As long as he was showing off, Michelangelo decided he should do a thorough job, and so he asked, "Why should not 6 months of my work support a family for half a year? That is simple justice." Lodovico was jubilant. "I haven't had my hands on 50 gold florins for a long time. Michelangelo, you must start on another piece immediately, tomorrow morning, since they are so well paid." Michelangelo was amused. No word of thanks. Only undisguised joy at running his hands through this pile of gold pieces shimmering in the candlelight. Ironically, he remembered his own cry for marble when Lorenzo first invited him into the palace. "We're going to look for another farm," cried Lodovico. "Land is the only safe investment. Then with the extra income." "I'm not sure I can let you do that, father. Il Magnifico says he is giving me the florins for travel, to Venice or Naples, to see all the sculptures." "Travel to see sculptures?" Lodovico was aghast, his new acres disappearing before his eyes. "What purpose will it serve to look at sculptures? You look, you leave, the money is gone. But with new farms." His brother Buonarrotti asked, "Are you really going traveling, Michelangelo?" "No," said Michelangelo laughingly, "I want only to work." He turned to Lodovico. "They're yours, father." Several times a week Bertoldo insisted that they go to the churches to continue drawing from the masters. They carried wooden stools with them so they could move with the changing light. They were sketching in the Brancacite chapel in the Carmen. Agony set his stool so close to Michelangelo's that his shoulder pressed against Michelangelo's arm. Michelangelo moved his stool a little. Agony was offended. "I can't draw without a free arm," explained Michelangelo. "What are you so cranky about? All I wanted to do was amuse us while we work. I heard a bawdy new ballad last night. I want to concentrate. I'm bored. We've drawn these frescoes 50 times. What more is there to learn? How to draw like Masaccio? I want to draw like Torrigiani. That's good enough for me." Without looking up, Michelangelo barked impatiently, "But not good enough for me. Look who's talking. I won 3 drawing prizes last year. How many did you win?" None. That's why you'd better let me learn. Agony felt he had been scored against. He said with a crooked smile, I'm surprised the favorite student still has to submit to these schoolboy exercises. Copying mass action is not a schoolboy exercise, except to a schoolboy mind. Oh, so now your mind is better than mine. Flaring, I thought it was only your drawing hand. If you could draw, you would know there is no difference. And if you could do anything else but draw, you would know how little you are alive. It's as they say, little man, little life, big man, big life. Big man, big wind. Agony was furious. Michelangelo swiveled on his stool to face the painting by Filippino Lippi of the Emperor's Son whom Street Peter had raised from the dead, the one for which Ecstasy had posed when he was 13. Agony pushed his stool around so that he could stare head on at Michelangelo. You meant that as an insult? He sprang up from his stool, put his massive hand on Michelangelo's shoulder and yanked him to his feet. Michelangelo had time to see the grim set of Agony's expression, which told him that Agony was striking with all his might, but he had no chance to duck or avoid the blow. Agony's fist exploded on the bridge of his nose with the sound of powder exploding behind a cut of Beatrice Serena in the Maiano quarry. He tasted blood and crushed bone in his mouth, and then, as from a distance, heard Bertolto's anguished cry. What have you done? While stars burst in a black heaven, Michelangelo heard Agony reply. I felt his bone and cartilage crumble like biscuit beneath my knuckles. Michelangelo slipped angularly to his knees, the blue stars circling the painted chapel. He felt the hard cold cement against his cheek, saw the dead green Ecstasy on the fresco, then lost consciousness. He awakened in his bed in the palace. There were wet cloths over his eyes and nose. His head was a mass of pain. As he stirred, someone removed the cloths. He tried to open his eyes but could achieve only the slightest slit. Bending over him was Pierloni, Lorenzo's physician, Lorenzo and Bertolto. There was a knock on the door. He heard someone enter, say, Agony has fled the city, Excellency. Through the Porta Romana. Send our fastest riders after him. I'll lock him in the stocks with his back against the Signoria wall. Michelangelo let his lids fall again. The doctor resettled him on the pillow, wiped his mouth, then began exploring his face with his fingers. The bridge of his nose is crushed. The bone splinters may take as long as a year to work their way out. The passage is completely closed now. Later, if he's lucky, he'll be able to breathe through it again. He slipped an arm under Michelangelo's shoulder, raised him slightly and pressed a cup to his lips. Drink. It will put you to sleep. When you wake the pain will be less. It was torture to open his lips, but he gulped down the warm herb tea. The voice above him receded. Once again he slipped off, heard Agony's jeering words in his ears, saw the spinning blue stars and felt the cold paving on his cheek. When he awakened he was alone in the room. The pain had localized now, and he felt the throbbing behind his eyes and nose. There was light out the window. He pushed aside the covers, got out of bed, reeled, caught the side of the wash table to steady himself. Then, summoning courage, looked up into the mirror. Once again he had to grip the edge of the table to keep from fainting, for he could barely recognize his own face in the glass. Both of his eyes were swollen the size of blue goose eggs. He struggled to get the lids opened a trifle more, saw a wild palette of discoloration, purples and lavenders, orange and burnt sienna. He would not be able to know the full consequence of Agony's blow until the swelling went down. It would be weeks, perhaps months before he could see how completely his erstwhile friend had accomplished, in reverse, the redrafting job on his face for which he had longed. That one powerful blow from Torrigiani's big fist had thrown his face out of focus as surely as though Torrigiani had been shaping soft wax. Shivering with fever, he crawled on hands and knees back into his bed, pulled the covers over his head as though to wipe out the world and reality. And he was sick at heart. His pride had brought him to this low, beaten state. He heard the door open. Unwilling to see anyone, he remained motionless. A hand pulled back the cover from his head. He found himself gazing up at Contessina. Michelangelo mio. Contessina. I'm sorry it happened. Not so sorry as I. Torrigiani got away. But father swears he'll catch him. Michelangelo moved his head painfully on the pillow. It would do no good. I blame myself. I taunted him. Beyond his powers of endurance. He began it. We've heard the story. He felt hot tears stinging his eyes as he forced himself to say the crudest words that could escape his lips. I'm ugly. Her face had been close to his as they spoke, almost in whispers to ensure their privacy from her nurse, who lolled uncertainly at the open door. Without moving she placed her lips on the swollen distorted bridge of his nose, and he felt their faint warm moisture like an annealing balm. Then she was gone from the room. The days passed. He could not bring himself to leave the palace, even though the swelling and pain continued to recede. His father heard the news, came to assess the damage. Lodovico seemed happier to be vindicated in his judgment on art and artists than saddened as what had happened to his son's face. He was also concerned that the 3 gold florins might not show up while Michelangelo was confined to his room. Will Lorenzo stop your wage? Michelangelo was furious. It isn't a wage. And it won't be stopped because I'm not working. Perhaps nobody will think I have use for the money while I am locked up here. Lodovico grumbled, I counted on it, and left. He has no right to reproach me, sighed Michelangelo to Buonarrotti when he came to visit, bringing a bowl of chicken soup with toasted almonds from Lucrezia. Buonarrotti was now apprenticed to the straw in the cloth trade. His expression was serious. Michelangelo, men need a little money of their own. This is a good time for you to put aside some florins. Let me come for a few weeks and mind the money for you. Michelangelo was touched at his brother's sympathetic concern, and amused at his newfound business acumen. Lorenzo visited for a few moments each afternoon, bringing a new cameo or ancient coin for them to discuss. Il Cardiere wandered by with his lyre to sing a salty version of the goings-on in Florence, including Michelangelo's mishap and rhymed couplets. Longino came to read Dante, Pico to show him some new findings on Egyptian stone carvings which indicated that the Greeks learned their main sculpture principles from the Egyptians. Contessina came with her nurse for the hour before dark, to study and chat. Even Giovanni and Giulio stopped by for a moment. Piero sent condolences. Jacopo of the impolite face and Tedesco the redhead came over from Gerlanteils to assure him that if they saw Torrigiani on the streets of Florence they would stone him clear out of the Porta Prato. Granexi spent hours in the apartment, bringing drawing materials and folios. The doctor came to probe his nose with sticks, and finally assure him that he would breathe through one nostril at least. Bertoldo was charming about having his privacy invaded. He tried to comfort Michelangelo. Torrigiani thought to flatten your talent with his fist so it would reach his own level. Michelangelo shook his head. Granexi warned me. Still, it is true, people who are jealous of talent want to destroy it in others. You must come back to work now. We miss you in the garden. Michelangelo studied himself in the mirror over the wash basin. The bridge of his nose had been caved in permanently. with a massive hump in the middle, the nose careened from the corner of his right eye toward the left corner of his mouth, wiping out whatever symmetry it had had before. He winced. What a botched-up piece of sculpture! The stone was soft and filled with holes. It shattered at the first blow of the hammer. Now it is spoiled, without balance or design, scarred like an abandoned quarry in a mountainside. I was never much to look at, but how I loathed this crushed-in view of myself. He was filled with a bitter despair. Now he would truly be the ugly sculptor trying to create beautiful marbles. The swelling receded, that discoloration faded, but he was still unable to present himself to the world in this changed, mutilated form. If he could not face Florence in the light, he slipped out late at night and walked the silent streets for hours, working off his caged energies. How different the city looked with the oil lamps lighted high on the palaces, how much larger the slumbering stone buildings seemed in the starlight. Michelangelo came to the apartment one day, ignoring Bertoldo, and asked, "May I sit down?" "Michelangelo, I have just completed my translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses into Italian. While I was translating Nestor's tale of the centaurs, I thought of what a fine carving you could make of the battle between the centaurs and the Thessalians." Michelangelo sat on the bed watching Michelangelo intently, comparing their uglinesses as Michelangelo crouched forward in the chair, his beady eyes and oily black hair seeming to Michelangelo as moist as the purple, repulsively carnal lips. Yet ugly as Michelangelo was, his face was lighted by an inner glow as he spoke of Ovid and his poetic recounting of the Greek tales. The opening lines will set the stage. Pyrrhus took as bride young Dame. To celebrate the day, tables were set up, and couches placed for greater luxury. Beside them in a green, well-arbored grotto. Among the guests were centaurs, rugged creatures. Myself, a nobleman of Thessaly. In his soft, modulated voice Michelangelo went on to tell of the gaiety of the palace. Oh, the bride was lovely. Then we began to say how sweet the bride was. But our intentions began to bring ill fortune to the wedding. Eurytus, craziest of rough-hewn centaurs, grew hot with wine, but when he saw the bride, was that much hotter. Tables were rocked, turned upside down, then tossed away. Someone had seized the bride and mounted her. It was Eurytus, while the other centaurs took women as they pleased, first come, first taken. The scene was like the looting of a city. Vividly he projected the scenes into the room, Theseus swinging an ancient urn full of wine across Eurytus' face, until the creature's brains burst forth from the broken skull, Granius throwing the altar on the heads of two men, Eurytus killing his man by thrusting torch and fire down his throat. Michelangelo's eyes went to the cupboard on which stood the model for Bertoldo's Battle of Romans and Barbarians. Michelangelo followed his gaze. "No, no," he said, "Bertoldo's battle is a copy of the sarcophagus at Pisa, a reproduction, actually. Yours would be original." Bertoldo was furious. "You are lying. Michelangelo, I'll take you to Pisa and show you. Tomorrow. You will see that in the center of the sarcophagus there are no figures at all. I had to recreate them. I introduced whole new themes for narrative, like my riding warrior." Michelangelo put his manuscript into Michelangelo's hands. "Read it at your leisure. I thought of you carving the scenes even while I translated them. You could not find a more powerful theme." Bertoldo ordered horses that night. At dawn they were riding down the Arno to the sea, past Empoli, until the dome and leaning campanile of Pisa stood against the powder blue sky. Bertoldo led Michelangelo directly into the Camposanto, a rectangular cemetery surrounded by a wall begun in 1278, its galleries were lined by some 600 tombs and ancient sarcophagi. Bertoldo made for the Roman battle scene and, coveting his pupil's good opinion, elaborately explained the differences between this sarcophagus and his own battle. The more he pointed out the differences, the more Michelangelo saw the similarities. Placatingly, he murmured, "You told me that even in art we all have to have a father and a mother." Nicola Pisano, starting modern sculpture right on this spot, was able to do so because he saw these Roman sarcophagi that had been hidden for 1,000 years. Mollified, Bertoldo took them to an osteria behind a grocery store, where they ate tiny fish and beans, and while the old man slept for a couple of hours, Michelangelo returned to the Duomo, and then to the baptistery, much of it designed by Nicola and Giovanni Pisano. Containing Nicola Pisano's masterpiece, a marble pulpit with 5 high reliefs. Outside once again, he looked at the company leaning dizzily against the brilliant Pisan sky. He thought, Bertoldo was only partly right. It is not enough to be an architect and sculptor, one must also be an engineer. Riding home in the cool dusk with the soft, mottled hills gliding past, the horse's hooves rhythmic on the hard-packed dirt road, Michelangelo began to see pictures in his mind, of struggles between men, of the rescue of women, of the wounded, the dying. When they had reached the palace and Bertoldo had fallen into a fast sleep, he lit a lamp and began reading Polizano's translation. He had read only a few pages when he asked himself, but how could one carve this legend? It would require a piece of marble the size of a Galanteo fresco. Nor could a sculptor use all the weapons employed in the mythological battle: altars, torches, spears, antlers, javelins, tree trunks. The marble would turn out to be a jumble. He recalled an earlier line and leafed back through the pages until he found it. A frost lifted a sheet of rock ripped from the mountainside. The image was vivid for him. He became excited. Here could be a unifying theme, an unifying force. His theme. Since one could not portray all weapons, he would use only one, the earliest and the most universal, stone. He pulled off his shirt and bray and stretched himself under the red coverlet, his hands behind his head. He realized that he had been out all day, among people, and had not once thought of his nose. Equally important, images began crowding through his mind, not of the Camposanto or the Pisano baptistery, but of the Battle of the Centaurs. Glory be to God, he thought, I'm cured. Rustesi was overjoyed. Didn't I tell you to sketch horses? A work of art without a horse is nothing. Amused, Michelangelo replied, now if you can show me where to find some centaurs. The tension was gone from the garden. No one mentioned Torrigiani's name or referred to the quarrel. Torrigiani had not been caught, and probably never would be. Excited by his new project, Michelangelo concentrated on the resolving of his theme. Polizano, flushed with pleasure, gave a summary of the centaur's role in mythology while Michelangelo sketched rapidly, drawing what he imagined it might be like, the whole of the horse except the shoulders, neck and head, and, emerging from the body of the horse, the torso and head of a man. He cared little for mythological legends, they were foreign to his nature. He was drawn to reality, as much of it as he could grasp. For him, the truest, most significant reality was the male figure, containing within itself the prototype of all other forms and designs. He began searching within himself for an overall design into which he could fit some 20 figures. How many separate scenes of action could there be? What would be the central focus, from which the eye would move in orderly, perceptive manner as he, the sculptor, wanted? In the Roman battle sarcophagus in Pisa and Bertoldo's battle relief, the warriors and women were clothed. As long as he was going back to Greek legend, he felt he had the right to carve nudes, unencumbered by helmets, robes, loincloths which in his opinion cluttered Bertoldo's bronze. Hoping to achieve simplicity and control, he eliminated clothing as he had ruled out horses and the multiplicity of centaurs and weapons. With this decision he got nowhere. Even Ecstasy could not help him. It was never possible to get nude models. Couldn't I rent a small studio somewhere, work alone? Ecstasy shook his head angrily. You are Lorenzo's protégé, everything you do reflects on him. Then there's only one thing left to do. I'll work up at the cave Maiano. He walked up to Settignano in the cool of evening. As he came across the dark fields and forded the creek at the bottom of the ravine, he had a moment of apprehension. The Topolinos had heard about the fight with Tuorigini, but they would make no such scene as had occurred in the Buonarrotti home the first time he returned, with his stepmother and aunt weeping, his uncle cursing, and his grandmother standing silent, her eyes dry, but suffering for him as he had suffered for himself. The Topolinos greeted him casually. They were pleased that he was spending the night. If they noted the damage to his face, or even peered through the dark evening to gauge its extent, he could not tell it. He washed in the creek at dawn, then made his way over the ox roads rutted along the contour of the hills to the quarries, where the stonemasons began work an hour after sunrise. From the top of the mountain he looked down on a castle surrounded by parallel lines of olives and grapevines. In the quarry the Beatrice Serena cut the afternoon before it was a turquoise blue while the older blocks were taking on a beige tone. 10 columns had been completed, and a huge panther blocked out, surrounded by a sea of chips. The quarrymen and masons were already forging and tempering their tools, each used 25 points in a day, so quickly did the Beatrice Serena wear them down. The masons were in good humor, greeting Michelangelo jovially. Come back to the quarries to do an honest day's work, eh? Once a stonemason always a stonemason. In this weather? Quipped Michelangelo. I'm going to sit under a cool tree and never pick up anything heavier than a stick of charcoal. They needed no further explanation. The Beatrice Serena threw off tremendous heat. The masons removed their clothes, everything except breechclout, straw hat and leather sandals. Michelangelo sat watching them. They could not pose, they had their day's stone to cut, and their small bodies, lean, wiry, bumpy, were a long way from the ideal of Greek beauty that he had seen in early statues. But in the warm sun the sweat on their skin caused them to shine and glisten like polished marble. They used every muscle of back and shoulder and leg to cut and lift the stone. They were completely unself-conscious as he sketched them, seeking the strength that lay buried in the indestructible bodies of these skilled craftsmen. When the morning was half spent the masons gathered in their hall, a cave cut out of the Beatrice Serena at the base of the mountain which remained the same temperature the year round. Here they ate their breakfast of herring and onion, bread and red Chianti wine. Michelangelo told them of his proposed battle of the centaurs. It's time this ridge of stone under Mount Caesar produced another sculptor, said a young, hard-bodied quarryman. We have always had one, Mino da Fesol, Desiderio da Settignano, Benedetto da Maiano. In a few minutes they returned to work and Michelangelo to his drawing, working close up now, catching the tensions of the hands, the protrusion about the second phalanges, where the skin was stretched from holding hammer and chisel. How much there was to learn about the human body. How many thousands of intricate parts, each different, each with its fascinating detail. An artist could draw the human figure all his life and still catch only a fraction of its changing forms. When the sun was high overhead several young boys appeared, carrying on their shoulders long branches with a row of nails in them, and hanging from each nail a basket with a man's dinner. Once again they gathered in the cool hall. The quarrymen shared their vegetable soup, boiled meat, bread, cheese and wine with Michelangelo, then lay down for an hour's sleep. While they slept he drew them, sprawled out on the ground, hats over their faces, their bodies quiet, recuperative, the lines tranquil, the forms somnolent. By the time they awakened the children had returned bringing fresh water to drink and for the forge, turning the wheels, sharpening the tools, using their hammers and chisels to help. Michelangelo sketched their supple limbs in action. The next morning as he left the palace he was surprised to have a monk stop him, ask his name, take a letter from the folds of his black robe, and disappear as soundlessly as he had appeared. Michelangelo unfolded the note, saw his brother's signature, began to read. It was a plea to Michelangelo to abandon the pagan, godless theme which could only put his soul in jeopardy, and if he must persist in carving graven images, to do only those sanctified by the Church. The Battle of the Centaurs is an evil story, Leonardo concluded, told to you by a perverted man. Renounce it and return to the bosom of Christ. Michelangelo reread the letter, shaking his head with disbelief. How could Leonardo, buried within the monastery walls, know what theme he was carving? And that it had been inspired by Poliziano. He was only an apprentice. How could anyone consider a learning theme important enough to tattle about? He was a little frightened at how much the monks inside San Marco knew of everyone's business. He took the letter to the studiolo, showed it to Lorenzo. If I am doing you harm by carving this theme, he said quietly, perhaps I ought to change? Lorenzo seemed worried. Bringing Savonarola to Florence had been a mistake and a disappointment. That is precisely what Francis Savonarola is trying to accomplish, to cow us all, to impose his rigid censorship. We are not going to help him convert the Duomo into the stench. If we give in on the smallest detail it will be easier for him to win the next one. Continue your work. Michelangelo threw his brother's letter into a bronze Etruscan pot under Lorenzo's desk. He used pure beeswax which came in cakes, placing a container over his charcoal fire and breaking the wax into small bits. When it had cooled he kneaded it with his fingers into strips. In the morning he poured a little trementina onto his fingers to make the wax more pliable. Since this sculpture was to be in high relief, the outer half of the figures would emerge from the marble. Moon-faced Agony, who was growing to hate stone carving with a ferocity deep as granite size, began spending his days at the shed, gradually taking on manual tasks and becoming Michelangelo's assistant. Michelangelo had him chop a wooden block the size of the marble block he intended to use, and drive wires through it for an armature. Then from his exploratory drawings he began modeling the wax figures, attaching them to the armature, balancing the intertwined arms, torsos, legs, heads and stones as they would tumble backward in the final marble. He found the block he wanted in the palace yard. Agony helped him bring the stone into his shed and set it up on round wooden beams to protect its corners. Just to stand and gaze at it gave Michelangelo a sense of intense power. When he began roofing out he worked with his whole body, planting both feet wide apart for support, throwing all his weight into the arm holding the hammer, achieving the sculptor's equilibrium. The force to remove must be equal to the marble to be taken away. He remembered having scrapped a pan with a piece of metal and having felt the metal in his teeth. Now he felt the marble in his veins. It was his desire to communicate his existence in space. That was one reason he had known that he must be a sculptor, to fill the void of emptiness with magnificent statues of noble marble, expressing their richest, most profound feelings. In its formation his 4-foot block had a veining like wood, angling off to where the sun rises. He checked for due east and rolled the block into the same position in which it had lain in its mountain bed. He would have to cut across the grain, north and south, otherwise his marble would peel in fragmented layers. He drew a deep breath, raised his hammer and chisel for the opening assault. Marble dust began to cover his hands and face, penetrating his clothes. It was good to touch his face and feel its dust. It was the same as touching the marble he was working on. He had the sensation of becoming one with his medium. Saturday nights the palace emptied. Piero and Alfonsina visited with the noble families of Florence. Giovanni and Giulio began a social round. Lorenzo sought pleasure with his group of young bloods, according to rumor, participating in orgies of drinking and love-making. Michelangelo never knew whether these tales were true, but the next day Lorenzo would be wan and listless. His gout, inherited from his father, would keep him in bed or hobbling about the palace with a heavy cane. On such evenings Michelangelo was free to have supper with Contassina and Giuliano on the open loggia of the top floor, in the soft night air. As they ate cold watermelon and chatted over candlelight, Contassina told him of having read the Boccaccio comments on the centaurs. "Oh, I've already left the original battle far behind," he laughed. He took paper from inside his shirt, a piece of charcoal from his purse, and moving the charcoal rapidly over the paper, he told Contassina what he was after. Man lived and died by stone. To suggest the unity of man and marble, the heads in the blocks being thrown would be indistinguishable. All 20 men, women and centaurs would be but one, each figure a facet of man's many-sided nature, animal as well as human, female as well as male, each attempting to destroy the other parts. He indicated with swift strokes some of the sculptural goals he was trying to achieve, the 3 receding levels of figures, each level in lower relief but not lower in vitality, the half-released forms appearing to be freestanding, each figure radiating its own force. "I once heard you say that behind a carving there must be worship. What will there be to worship in your version of man's battle? The supreme work of art, the male body, infinite in its expressiveness and beauty." Contassina unconsciously looked down at her thin legs, the barely beginning to blossom bosom, then met his eyes amusedly. "I can blackmail you for your pagan worship of the body of man. Plato might agree with you, but Savonarola would have you burned as a heretic." "No, Contassina. I admire man, but I worship God for being able to create him." They laughed, their heads close. Seeing Contassina's eyes move to the door and her head come up sharply, a mottled flush come to her cheeks, he turned and could tell from Lorenzo's posture that he had been standing there for a considerable time. Their intimacy had permeated the room, irradiating the atmosphere. Michelangelo had not been conscious of it. But interrupted at its height, it provided an aura that neither he nor Contassina nor Lorenzo could miss. Lorenzo stood silent, his lips compressed. "We were discussing. I had made some drawings." The harshness receded from Lorenzo's brow. He came forward to look at the drawings. "Julia reports your meetings to me. Your friendship is good. It can hurt neither of you. It is important that artists have friends. And Medici as well." A few nights later, when the moon was full and the air stirring with wild scents, they sat together in a library window seat overlooking the Via Larga and the enclosing hills. "Florence is full of magic in the moonlight," sighed Contassina. "I wish I could look down from a height and see it all." "I know a place," he exclaimed. "Just across the river. It's as though you could reach out your arms and embrace the city. Could we go? Now, I mean. We could slip out the back garden, separately. I'll put on a full-head cape." They walked the way he always went, at a sharp angle toward the Ponte Algregi, crossing the Arno and climbing up to the ancient fort. Sitting on the stone parapet, it was as though they were dangling their feet in the grey stone waters of the city. Michelangelo pointed out her father's villa in Fassole, the body just below it, the wall of 8 towers guarding the city at the foot of the Fassole hills, the glistening white cluster of baptistery, Duomo and Campanile, the golden-stoned, high-towered Signoria, the tight oval city enclosed by its walls and river, and on their side of the river the moonlit Pitti Palace built of stone from its own quarry in the Boboli Gardens just behind the parapet. They sat a little apart, touched by the moon, caught up in the beauty of the city and the ranges of hills that embraced them as fondly as was Florence by her walls. Their fingers fumbled slowly toward each other on the rough surface of the stone, touched and interlocked. The repercussion came quickly. Lorenzo, who had been taking the baths at Vignon for several days, summoned him from the garden. He was seated at the big desk in his office, its walls covered with the map of Italy, a map of the world, the Sforza Castle in Milan, the tables and shelves bearing a collection of hard stone vases, ivories, purple leather volumes of Dante and Petrarch, a Bible bound in purple velvet with silver ornaments. Standing beside him was his secretary, Ser Piero da Bibbiena. Michelangelo did not need to be told why he had been sent for. "She was safe, Excellency. By my side the whole time." "So I gather. Did you really think you would not be observed?" Giulio saw her going out the rear gate. "Miserable now," Michelangelo replied, "it was indiscreet." He lifted his eyes from the richly patterned Persian rug, cried, "It was so beautiful up there, as though Florence were a marble quarry, with its churches and towers cut out of a single stratum of stone." "I am not questioning your conduct, Michelangelo. But Ser Piero does question its wisdom. You know that Florence is a city of wicked tongues. They would not speak evil of a little girl." Lorenzo studied Michelangelo's face for a moment. "Contessina can no longer be interpreted as little girl. She is growing up. I had not fully realized it before. That is all, Michelangelo. You can return to work now, as I know you are impatient to do." Michelangelo did not move, even though he had been dismissed. "Is there not something I can do to make amends?" "I have already made them." Lorenzo came from behind his desk, put both hands on the boy's trembling shoulders. "Do not be unhappy. You meant no wrong. Change for dinner, there is someone you should meet." The last thing Michelangelo wanted in his wretched state was to eat with 60 guests, but this was no time to disobey. He washed splashingly out of his bowl, donned the russet silk tunic, and went up to the dining hall where a groom took him to a seat Lorenzo had saved next to Gian Francesco Aldovrandi, of one of the leading families of Bologna. Lorenzo had named Aldovrandi Podesta or visiting mayor of Florence for the year 1488. Michelangelo's concentration was not very good, his mind and stomach were in a turmoil. Aldovrandi turned his full attention on him. "His Excellency was so kind as to show me your drawings and the marble Madonna and Child. I was greatly stimulated." "Thank you. I am not indulging in compliments. I speak because I am a sculpture enthusiast myself, and I have grown up with the magnificent work of Jacopo della Quercia." Michelangelo numbly asked who he might be. "Ah, that is why I asked Il Magnifico if I could speak to you. Jacopo della Quercia is not known in Florence, yet he is one of the greatest sculptors that Italy has produced. He was the dramatist in stone, as Donatello was the poet. It is my hope that you will come to Bologna and permit me to show you his work. It could have a profound influence on you." Michelangelo wanted to reply that profound influences were precisely what he wished to avoid, yet Aldovrandi would prove to be a prophet. During the ensuing days Michelangelo heard that Piero and Alfonsina had several times protested against a commoner being allowed to associate on such intimate terms with the Medici, and Ser Piero da Bibbiena had written to Lorenzo at the baths, a veiled but strong note saying, if some decision is not taken about Contessina, we may regret it. It was not until several nights later that he learned what Lorenzo meant by amends. Contessina had been sent for a visit to the Ridolfi villa in the country. He received a message from his father. The family was concerned about Leonardo, who had been reported ill in the monastery at San Marco. "Could you use your Medici connections to get in to see Leonardo?" asked Lodovico, when he went to see them. "No outsider is allowed in the monks' quarters." "San Marco is a Medici church and monastery," said his grandmother, "built by Cosimo and supported by Lorenzo." After a number of days he found that his requests were being ignored. Then he learned that Savonarola would preach in San Marco the following Sunday. "The monks will all be there," Bertoldo told him. "You will get a look at your brother. You might even exchange a few words. Bring us back a report on the friar." San Marco was delightfully cool in the early morning. His plan to take up a position at the side door leading in from the cloister, so that Leonardo would have to pass close to him, was spoiled by the presence of the tight knot of monks in their black habits who had been praying and chanting in the choirs since before morning light. Their cowls were pulled so far forward that their faces were buried. It was impossible for Michelangelo to see whether Leonardo was in the group. The church was by no means full. When a murmur announced the entrance of Savonarola, he slipped into a pew close to the pulpit and sat on the edge of the hard bench. There was little to mark a difference between Savonarola and the other 50-odd monks as he slowly climbed the pulpit stairs. His head and face were deep in his Dominican cowl, a slight figure under the robe. Michelangelo could see little but the tip of his nose and a pair of dark veiled eyes. His voice had harsh northern accents. At first it was quiet, but soon it took on a commanding tone as he expounded his thesis on the corruption of the priesthood. Never, even in the most heated attacks in the palace, had Michelangelo heard the slightest part of the charges Savonarola now levied against the clergy. The priests were political rather than spiritual, put into the church by their families for worldly gain. They were careerists and opportunists seeking only wealth and power, guilty of simony, nepotism, bribery, selling of relics, accumulation of benefices. The adulteries of the church have filled the world. Warming to his task, Savonarola pushed back the cowl and Michelangelo got his first view of the friar's face. He found it as emotionally disturbing as the words that were coming with accelerating heat and rapidity from the contradictory mouth, the upper lip thin and ascetic as the material of a hair shirt, the lower lip more fleshy and voluptuous than Polizano's. The black eyes flashing to the farthest corner of the church were sunken under high-boned, hollowed-out cheeks, obviously the victims of fasting. His nose jutted outward in a massive ridge with wide, flaring nostrils. It was a dramatic face that could have been invented by no artist save Savonarola himself. The bone structure fascinated Michelangelo as a sculptor, for the dark marble-like chin was carved from the same flesh as the passionate hanging underlip, polished with pumice and emery stone. Michelangelo tore his eyes from Savonarola's face so that he might better hear the words that were now pouring like molten bronze, the voice filling the church, reverberating off the hollow chapels, returning to invade the left ear after it had boxed and reddened the right. I have beheld proud ambition invade Rome and contaminate all things, until she has become a false, proud harlot. O Italy, O Rome, O Florence, your villainies, your impieties, your fornications, your usuries, your cruelties are bringing us tribulations. Give up your pomps and shows. Give up, I tell you, your mistresses and your love boys. The earth is covered with blood, but the clergy cares not a rap. They are far indeed from God, those priests whose worship is to spend the night with harlots, the days gossiping together in the sacristies. The altar itself has been turned into a clerical shop. The sacraments are the counters of your simony. Your lust has made of you a brazen-faced whore. Once you were at least ashamed of your sins, once priests had the grace to call their sons nephews. They no longer bother now. I will descend on you in your scurrility and your wickedness, says the Lord, upon your whores and your palaces. He scourged the people of Florence, cried out that Dante had used Florence as his model for the city of Dis. Within the second circle are confined hypocrisy and flattery, and those who practice witchcraft, sorcery and theft, falsehood and simony and such like filth. Summoning his will, for Savonarola's voice was a paralyzing agent, Michelangelo looked around and saw that the congregation was sitting as one individual, soldered together. The whole of Italy will feel God's wrath. Her cities will fall prey to foes. Blood will run in the streets. Murder will be the order of the day. Unless ye repent. 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 The cry of repent echoed around the church 100-fold while Savonarola pulled his hood forward, masking his face, prayed long and silently, then came down the pulpit stairs and out the cloistered door, leaving Michelangelo deeply moved, a little exalted, a little sick. When he was again out in the hot glaring sunshine of the piazza he stood blindly blinking, unwilling to go to his home or to the palace, not knowing what to say. Finally he sent word to his father that he had been unable to see Leonardo. The emotional upheaval had faded when he received a note from Leonardo asking him to come to San Marco at Vespers. The cloister was beautiful at dusk, the grass freshly cut, the hedges trimmed, jasmine and sunflowers growing in the shade of the arches, the atmosphere tranquil and secluded from the world. Leonardo seemed to Michelangelo as cadaverous as Savonarola. The family has been worried about your health. Leonardo's head shrank deeper into the cowl. My family is the family of God. Don't be sanctimonious. When Leonardo spoke again Michelangelo detected a touch of affection. I called for you because I know you are not evil. You have not been corrupted by the palace. Even in the midst of Sodom and Gomorrah, you have not been debauched, you have lived like an anchorite. Amused, Michelangelo asked, how do you know these things? We know everything that goes on in Florence. Leonardo took a step forward, held out his bony hands. Francis Savonarola has had a vision. The Medici, the palace, all the obscene, godless artworks within its walls will be destroyed. They cannot save themselves, but you can, for your soul is not yet lost. Repent, and forsake them while there is still time. Savonarola attacked the clergy, I heard his sermon, but he did not attack Lorenzo. There are to be 19 sermons, starting on All Saints' Day, through to Epiphany. By the end of them, Florence and the Medici will be in flames. They stood side by side in the airless corridor along one side of the cloister. Michelangelo was shocked into silence. You won't save yourself? Implored Leonardo. We have different ideas. All of us can't be the same. We can. The world must be a monastery such as this, where all souls are saved. If my soul is to be saved, it can only be through sculpture. That is my faith, and my discipline. You said that I live like an anchorite, it's my work that keeps me that way. Then how can that work be bad? Wouldn't God give me a choice, as long as we both serve him equally? Leonardo's eyes burned into Michelangelo's for a moment. Then he was gone, through a door and up a flight of stairs. Into a cell decorated by Francis Angelico, I hope, said Michelangelo to himself, a little bitterly. He felt he owed it to Lorenzo to attend the All Saints' Day sermon. This time the church was full. Again Savonarola began in a quiet, expository manner, explaining the mysteries of Mass and the wholeness of the divine word. The newcomers seemed disappointed. But the friar was just working up warmth. Soon he had moved into oratory, and then into crescendo, his mighty voice whipping the congregation with its impassioned eloquence. He attacked the clergy. "Ye hear it said, bless the house that owns a fat cure. But a time will come when rather it will be said, woe to that house. Ye will feel the edge of the sword upon ye. Affliction shall smite ye. This shall no more be called Florence, but a den of thieves, of turpitude and bloodshed." He attacked the moneylenders. "Ye are guilty of avarice, ye have corrupted the magistrates and their functions. None can persuade ye that it is sinful to lend at usury, but rather ye hold them to be fools that refrain from it." He attacked the morals of Florence. "Ye have fulfilled the saying of Isaiah, they declare their sin as Sodom, for they hide it not, and that of Jeremiah, thou hadst a whore's forehead, thou refusedst to be ashamed." He declared, "I vowed not to prophesy," but a voice in the night said, "Fool, dost thou not see that it is God's will that thou shouldst continue? That is why I cannot stop prophesying. And I say unto ye, know that unheard of times are at hand." There was a deepening murmur in the church. Many of the women were weeping. Michelangelo rose, made his way up the side aisle, the angry voice following through the door. He crossed the Piazza San Marco, entered the garden and retreated to his shed, shaking as though with ague. He resolved not to return to the church, for what had this recital of lust and avarice to do with him? Contassina found him in the library where he was sketching from the illustrations in an ancient manuscript. She had been away for several weeks. Her face was ashen. He jumped up. "Contassina, have you been ill? Sit down here. I have something to tell you." She sank into the chair, leaned forward to the cold hearth as though to warm her hands. "The contracts have been drawn." "Contracts?" "For my marriage. To Piero Ridolfi. I did not want you to hear of it from the palace gossip." After an instant he asked brusquely, "Why should it affect me? Everyone knows that Medici daughters are given in political marriages. Maddalena to French Seto Sibo, the Pope's son, Lucrezia to Jacopo Salviati. I don't know why it should affect you, Michelangelo, any more than it should affect me." He met her eyes squarely, for the first time. "And does it? How could it? Everyone knows that Medici daughters are given in political marriage. Forgive me, Contassina. I was hurt." "It's all right," she smiled wistfully. "I know you by now." "And the marriage? When?" "Not for a while. I am too young. I asked for another year. Yet everything has changed. Not for us. We are still friends in the palace." After a silence, Michelangelo asked, "Piero Ridolfi, he will not make you unhappy? He is fond of you?" Contassina looked up at him with her head bowed. "We do not discuss such matters. I will do what I must. But my feelings are my own." She rose, went close to him. He hung his head like a dumb beast in a storm. When at last he looked up he saw tears sparkling in her eyes. He reached out his hand, tentatively, and slowly she placed her fingers into his until they were locked together quite hard. Then she withdrew, leaving behind only her faint mimosa scent, and a hot dryness in his throat. There was no way to keep Savonarola's ringing voice out of his ears, for Leonardo's warning became a reality. In the midst of his second sermon against vice in Florence, Savonarola suddenly cried out against the Medici, blamed Lorenzo for the evil of the city, predicted the downfall of the ruling family and, as a climax, the Pope in the Vatican. The Plato Academy assembled hastily in the studiolo. Michelangelo reported the first two sermons, then told of Leonardo's warning. Though Lorenzo had had his monumental battles with the Vatican, At this moment he wanted to keep the peace with Pope Innocent VIII because of Giovanni, who had only a few months to wait before he was invested a full cardinal and would leave for Rome to represent the Medici. The Pope might well imagine that since Lorenzo had summoned Savonarola to Florence, and Savonarola was preaching in a Medici church, he was attacking the papacy with Lorenzo's knowledge and consent. "It is a good thing he is attacking me at the same time," he murmured ruefully. "We'll simply have to shut him up," growled Polizano. "We need only to put an end to his prophecies," said Lorenzo. "They are no part of our religion or of his office. Pico, that much you will have to undertake." The first defection came from the sculpture garden. Granexi reported that the fun-loving Baccio fell silent for hours on end, then took to disappearing for a day or two at a time. Soon he began making derogatory remarks about the Medici, then he began extolling the virtues of Savonarola and the spiritual life of the cloister. One day he deserted to the Dominicans. Savonarola's sermons in San Marco were now attracting such large crowds that late in March, for the second Sunday in Lent, he transferred his activities to the cathedral. 10,000 Florentines stood packed together, yet dwarfed by the enormousness of space around them. In the few months that had passed since Michelangelo had heard him preach in San Marco, several changes had come over the friar. Because of his rigid fasting, the penance on his knees in the cells of San Marco, he could barely summon the strength to mount the pulpit stairs. He had assumed a complete identification of himself with Christ. "As ye can see and hear, I do not speak with my own tongue but that of God. I am his voice on earth." A cold shiver ran through the congregation. Savonarola was no less moved than his admirers. Michelangelo timed his arrival at the Duomo to meet his father and the rest of the family, deserters from Santa Croce to hear the new prophet, with the end of the service. He stood inside the door and gazed up at the Donatello and Luca della Robbia choir stalls high on either side of the central altar, marble carvings of children at play, singing, dancing, laughing, serenading with musical instruments, pure Greek in their joyous love of life, in their testament to the beauty of their young bodies. For Michelangelo, the marbles cried out, "People are good." While Savonarola was thundering, "Humanity is evil." Who was right? Donatello and della Robbia? Or Savonarola? The gloom of the church sat heavily around the Buonarrotti dinner table. Lucrezia was in tears. "That wicked man. He has ruined my beautiful white veil. From now on, Lodovico, if you wish to hear Savonarola preach it must be after dinner and not before." Though the city was shaking in a religious upheaval, Michelangelo kept working calmly. Unlike Savonarola, he could not persuade himself that God was speaking through him, but he did feel that if God saw he would approve the work. He felt a grudging admiration for Savonarola. Was he not an idealist? As for his fanaticism, had not trust as he said, "You're like Savonarola, you fast because you can't bring yourself to stop work in the middle of the day." Michelangelo grimaced at the accusation. Yet did he not feel a dedication to the task of revolutionizing marble sculpture even as Phidias had taken death-worshipping Egyptian sculpture and rendered it Greek-human? Would he not have been willing to fast and pray until he barely had the strength to drag himself through the garden to his workshop, if that were necessary? And what was wrong with God speaking to his children? Surely he had the right? The power? He believed in God. If God could create the earth and man, could he not create a prophet? Or a sculptor? The Signoria invited Savonarola to address them in the great hall of the Palazzo della Signoria. Lorenzo, the Plato for the important Medici hierarchy throughout the city, announced its intention of going. Michelangelo took his place on a long bench between Cantassina and Giovanni, facing the platform on which Savonarola stood before a wooden lectern, with the city government bank behind. When Savonarola first mentioned Lorenzo de' Medici as a tyrant, Michelangelo saw Lorenzo's lips lift in a faint smile. He himself barely heard the words, for he was gazing about the great hall with its long side panels of pure white plaster and thinking what magnificent frescoes could be painted there. Lorenzo's smile vanished as Savonarola mounted his attack. All the evil and all the good of the city depend from its head, and therefore great is his responsibility. If he followed the right path, the whole city would be sanctified. Tyrants are incorrigible because they are proud. They leave all in the hands of bad ministers. They hearken not unto the poor, and neither do they condemn the rich. They corrupt voters and aggravate the burdens of the people. Now Michelangelo began listening intently, for Savonarola charged that Lorenzo had confiscated the Florentine dower fund, monies paid into the city treasury by poorer families as guarantee that they would have the eventual dowry without which no Tuscan girl could hope to marry, that Lorenzo had used the money to buy sacrilegious manuscripts and evil works of art, to stage bacchanals through which he rendered the people of Florence prey to the devil. Lorenzo's dark skin turned green. Savonarola was not through. Lorenzo, the corrupt tyrant, must go. The dishonest Signoria sitting behind him must go. The judges, the officials, must go. An entirely new government, ruled by a completely new and rigorous set of laws, must be installed to render Florence the city of God. Who was to govern Florence? Revise its laws and execute them? Savonarola. God had ordered it. When Michelangelo reached the studiolo he found Francis Mariano there. The humanist preacher of San Gallo had been losing his congregation to Savonarola. Michelangelo drew his usual chair to the low table, put an apple on his plate, and then sat back. We will not attempt to refute Savonarola's personal slanders, Lorenzo was saying. The facts of such matters as the dower fund are clear for all Florentines to see. But his prophesying of doom is causing a mounting hysteria in Florence. Francis Mariano, I have been thinking that you are the one to answer Savonarola. Could I suggest that you preach a sermon on Acts 1-7, it is not for you to know the times and seasons which the Father has fixed by his own authority? Francis Mariano's face lighted. I could review the history of prophecy, the ways in which God speaks to his people, and show that all Savonarola lacks is a witch's cauldron. Gently, said Lorenzo. Your sermon must be quiet and irrefutable, in fact as well as logic, so that our people will see the difference between revelation and witchcraft. The discussion centered around what biblical and literary materials Francis Mariano should use. Michelangelo ate a little of the fruit, slipped out unnoticed. There followed a month of tranquility and steady work. He locked out all contact with the world, eating and sleeping little, tackling the 20 intertwined entities of his marble block. The palace spread the word that the faithful should go to San Gallo on Holy Thursday to hear Francis Mariano demolish Francis Savonarola. When Michelangelo walked into the church he found there every important family in Tuscany, nobles, landowners, merchants, scholars, travelers from Europe and England, the Signoria, judges and councillors from the four quarters of Florence. Francis Mariano mounted the pulpit and began in his cultivated, scholarly voice by quoting from Cosimo de' Medici, "States are not ruled by paternosters," which brought a ripple of laughter. He then spoke learnedly on the need for separation of church and state, and the dangers to human freedom when, as in the past, they had been combined. It was a good beginning. Lorenzo sat relaxed on his bench. The congregation listened intently with growing satisfaction, as Mariano proceeded by logical steps, quoting from Scripture, to show the true role of the Church and its position in the spiritual life of its people. Then something went wrong. Francis Mariano's face grew red, his arms were thrown up to the heavens in as violent a gesture as any of Savonarola. His voice changed as he mentioned for the first time the name of Girolamo Savonarola, spitting it out as something diseased. He threw away his carefully prepared argument, called the friar a disseminator of scandal and disorder, and a series of evil epithets. Michelangelo could think of only one answer. Francis Mariano had allowed his jealousy of Savonarola to conquer his judgment. He was still shouting from the pulpit when Lorenzo gathered his family about him and limped down the Sant'Orale and out of the church. Now for the first time Michelangelo found the palace soaked in gloom. Lorenzo suffered an acute attack of the gout and could barely hobble about the halls. Pilizzano, visibly shaken, clung to Lorenzo like a child. His wit and profundity vanished. Ficino and Longino were apprehensive about their lifetime work, for Savonarola was threatening to burn all the books in Florence except the approved Christian commentaries. Pico was the hardest hit. Not only had he recommended bringing the fire to Florence, he was still sympathetic to most of Savonarola's program, and too honest to conceal it from Lorenzo. Lorenzo rallied to make another frontal attack by asking Prior Biccolini of Santo Spirito to join them in the studiolo. Michelangelo had become acquainted with the prior at Sunday dinners in the palace, and sometimes returned with him to the church to sketch in the afternoon from such familiar frescoes as the Young Street. John, the prior, an energetic man of 50, was famous in Florence as the only one who wore his spectacles on the street. The faces of people as they hurry by, he once explained to Michelangelo, are like the pages of a book fluttering past. Through these magnifying lenses I study their expressions and character. Now the prior sat before the low table in the studiolo while Lorenzo asked if he would send to Rome for the Augustinians' most brilliant preacher to spell some sense into the Florentines. I think I know our man. I shall write at once. Florence turned out to hear the visiting Augustinian monk expose, intellectually, the extremities and danger of Savonarola's preaching, came to Santo Spirito, listened politely to his words, and went away unheeding. Michelangelo again tried to lock himself in his shed, but the walls were too thin to keep out each day's ration of bad news. Pico tried to dissuade Lorenzo from setting spies on Savonarola on the grounds that he was too dedicated to commit the kind of sin of the flesh in which Lorenzo hoped to catch him. Savonarola's espionage system caught Lorenzo's spies and exposed them. Francis Mariano had deserted Lorenzo and gone on his knees to Savonarola to implore forgiveness. Only a handful of students had attended the last lectures of the Plato Academy. Florence's printers were refusing to print anything the friar did not approve. Sandro Botticelli had deserted to Savonarola, publicly declaring his female nudes to be lewd, lascivious and immoral. Michelangelo still approved Savonarola's crusade for reform. He disapproved only of the attacks on the Medici and the arts. When he tried to explain this dilemma, Bertoldo grew querulous and, when Michelangelo next showed him his work, exclaimed that Michelangelo had missed the whole point of the Battle of the Centaurs. "It's too bare. You haven't learned anything from my battle or the one in Pisa. You've designed out all the richness. Savonarola's influence, I would guess. You need the horses, the flowing robes, the weapons, else what have you left to carve?" "People," muttered Michelangelo under his breath. "Your marble is poverty-stricken. If you want my opinion you'll throw away this block as an exercise that went wrong, and ask Granexate to find you a new one." Bertoldo did not come to the rear of the garden for several days. Michelangelo had a visitor in his place, his brother Leonardo, in cloak and cowl, sunk and cheeked. "Welcome to my workshop, Leonardo." Leonardo gazed with set jaw at the battle. "It is your sculpture I have come about. We want you to offer it up to God." How do I do that? By destroying it. Along with the drawings Botticelli has brought in, and other art obscenities that the congregation has volunteered. It is to be Savonarola's first fire in the purifying of Florence. This was the second invitation to destroy his work. You consider my marble obscene? It is sacrilegious. Bring it to San Marco and fling it on the flames yourself. Leonardo's voice had an intensity of emotional fervor that set Michelangelo on edge. He took him by the elbow, even in his anger able to feel that there was no flesh whatever on his brother's bones, escorted him to the rear gate and put him into the street. He had planned to do weeks of polishing to bring out the highlights of his figures. Instead he asked Granexite to help him move the block into the palace that night. Granexite borrowed a wheelbarrow which Bogardini pushed through the Piazza San Marco and down the Via Larga. With Bogardini and Granexite helping, he carried the block to Lorenzo's sitting room. Lorenzo had not seen the piece for a month, not since Francis Mariano's sermon. He came into the room, face sallow, eyes lackluster, hobbling painfully with the aid of a cane, and was taken completely by surprise. "Ah!" he exclaimed, and dropped into a chair. He sat for a long time in silence, his gaze riveted on the sculpture, studying it section by section, figure by figure, the color rising in his cheeks. Vitality seemed to return to his limbs. Michelangelo remained standing behind him, also studying the marble. Finally Lorenzo turned and looked up at him, his eyes gleaming. "You were right not to polish. The chisel textures help bring out the anatomy. Then you approve the carving, Excellency?" "What is there to approve? I can feel every body, every stone, every crushed bone, the fingers of the injured youth in the corner, pressed into his hair and skull, his arms sheltering the stones he will never throw. It's unlike any marble I've seen. We've already had an offer for the piece." "A patron? Someone wants to buy?" "Not exactly. They want it as a contribution from Savonarola, through my brother Leonardo, to offer it up to God on their bonfire." There was an almost imperceptible pause before Lorenzo said, "And you answered?" "That I was not free to give it. The piece belonged to Lorenzo de' Medici. The marble is yours, even to give to Savonarola for burning, if that is your wish. But suppose, Excellency, that I had already offered the piece to God? The God who created man in his own image of goodness and strength and beauty? Savonarola says that man is vile. Would God have created us in hate?" Lorenzo rose abruptly, walked about the room with only the barest indication of a limp. A groom came in, set the small table with 2 places. "Sit down and eat while I talk to you." "I too will eat, though I had no appetite before you came." He reached for a crisp crust of bread. "Michelangelo, the forces of destruction march on the heels of creativity. The arts, finest flowering of each age, are worn down, broken, burned by the next. Sometimes, as you see here in Florence today, by erstwhile friends and neighbors in the same city in the same year. Savonarola is not only after what he calls the non-religious works and the lascivious nudes, he also means to destroy the painting and sculpture that does not fit into his pattern, the frescoes of Masaccio, Filippo Lippi, the Benozzo Gozzias here in the Palace Chapel, the Guerlanteiois, all of the Greek and Roman statuary, most of our Florentine marbles. Little will remain but the Francis Angelico angels in the San Marco cells. If he has his way, and his power is growing, Florence will be ravished, as was Athens by Sparta. The Florentines are a fickle people. If they follow Savonarola to the end of his announced road, everything that has been accomplished since my great-grandfather offered his prize for the baptistery doors will be wiped out. Florence will slip back into darkness. Shaken by the intensity of Lorenzo's emotion, Michelangelo cried, "How wrong I was to think that Savonarola would reform only what was evil in Florentine life. He will destroy everything that is good as well. As a sculptor I would be a slave, with both hands cut off." "Nobody misses the loss of another man's freedom," replied Lorenzo sadly. Then he pushed aside his plate. "I want you to take a walk with me. There is something I must show you." They went to the rear of the palace and across a small enclosed square to the front of San Lorenzo, the family church of the Medici. Inside was buried Cosimo, Lorenzo's grandfather, near one of the bronze pulpits designed by Donatello and executed by Bertoldo. In the old sacristy, designed by Brunelleschi, was a sarcophagus containing Cosimo's parents, Giovanni de' Bisi and his wife, and a porphyry sarcophagus of Piero de' Gualti, Lorenzo's father, created by Verrocchio. But the principal face of the church remained of rough, unevenly spaced, earth-colored brick, obviously uncompleted. "Michelangelo, this is the last great work of art I must complete for my family, a marble facade with some 20 sculptured figures standing in its niches." 20 sculptures. That's as many as stand in this facade of the Duomo. But not too many for you. One full-size statue for every figure suggested in your battle. We must create something over which all Italy will rejoice. Michelangelo wondered whether the sinking feeling in his diaphragm was joy or dismay. Impetuously he cried, "I will do it, Lorenzo, I promise. But I will need time. I still have so much to learn. I have not yet tried my first freestanding figure." When he reached his apartment he found Bertoldo wrapped in a blanket, sitting over a live-coal brazier in his half of the L, his eyes red and his face a pasty white. Michelangelo went quickly to his side. "Are you all right, Bertoldo?" "No, I'm not all right. I'm a stupid, blind, ridiculous old man who has outworn his time." "What leads you to this harsh conclusion?" asked Michelangelo lightly, trying to cheer him. "Looking at your battle in Lorenzo's room, and remembering the things I said about it, I was wrong, terribly wrong. I was trying to turn it into a cast bronze piece. Your marble would have been spoiled. You must forgive me. Let me put you to bed." He settled Bertoldo under the feather bed quilt, went down to the basement kitchen and ordered a mug of wine heated on the dying embers. He held the silver cup to Bertoldo's lips, feeding consolation with the hot liquid. "If the battle is good, it's because you taught me how to make it good. If I couldn't make it like bronze, it was because you made me aware of the differences between solid marble and fluid metal. So be content. Tomorrow we will start a new piece, and you will teach me more." "Yes, tomorrow," sighed Bertoldo. He closed his eyes, opened them again briefly, asked, "Are you sure, Michelangelo, there is a tomorrow?" and dropped off to sleep. In a few moments there was a change in his breathing. It seemed to become heavy, labored. Michelangelo went to wake Ser Piero, who sent a groom for Lorenzo's doctor. Michelangelo spent the night holding Bertoldo so that he could breathe a little more easily. The doctor confessed that he could think of nothing to do. At first light Bertoldo opened his eyes, gazed at Michelangelo. The doctor and Ser Piero understood his plight, and whispered, "Take me to Poggio. It's so beautiful." When a groom came to announce that the carriage was ready, Michelangelo picked Bertoldo up, blankets and all, and held him on his lap for the drive out toward Pistoia, to the most exquisite of the Medici villas, formerly owned by Michelangelo's cousins, the Rucellai, and remodeled with magnificent open galleries by Giuliano da Sangallo. Rain lashed at their carriage all the way, but once Bertoldo was installed in the high bed in his favorite room, overlooking the Ombrone River, the sun emerged and lighted the lush green Tuscan landscape. Lorenzo rode out to comfort his old friend, bringing Maestro Stefano da Prato to try some new medicines. Bertoldo died in the late afternoon of the second day. After the priest had given him extreme unction, he uttered his last words with a little smile, as though trying to make his exit as a wit rather than a sculptor. "Michelangelo, you are my heir, as I was Donatello's." "Yes, Bertoldo. And I am proud. I want you to have my estate. If you wish. It will make you rich, famous. My cookbook. I shall always treasure it." Bertoldo smiled again, as though they shared a secret joke, and closed his eyes for the last time. Michelangelo said his goodbyes silently, turned away. He had lost his master. There would never be another. The disorganization of the garden was now complete. All work stopped. Granexi gave up the painting of a street festival scene that he had almost completed and spent his time feverishly supplying models, finding marble blocks, scaring up small commissions for a sarcophagus, a Madonna. Michelangelo cornered his friend late one afternoon. "It's no good, Granexi. School is over." "Don't say that. We have only to find a new master. Lorenzo said last night I could go to Sistine to seek one." Sansovino and Rustesi drifted into the studio. "Michelangelo is right," said Sansovino. "I'm going to accept the invitation from the King of Portugal, and go there to work." "I think we've learned all we can as students," agreed Rustesi. "I was never intended for cutting stone," said Bugardini. "My nature is too soft. It's made for mixing oil and pigment. I'm going to ask Gerlateo to take me back." Granexi snapped at Michelangelo. "Don't tell me you're leaving too." "Me? Where would I go?" The group broke up. Michelangelo walked home with Granexi to report the death of Bertoldo to the family. Lucrezia was excited by the cookbook, reading several of the recipes aloud. Lodovico showed no interest. "Michelangelo, it is finished, your new sculpture?" "Sort of. Il Magnifico, he has seen it?" "Yes, I took it to him." "Did he like it?" "Yes." "That's all, just yes." "Didn't he show pleasure, approval?" "Yes, father, he did." "Then where is the money?" "What money?" "The 50 florins." "I don't know what." "Come now. Il Magnifico gave you 50 florins when you finished the Madonna and Child. Hand over the purse." "There is no purse." "No purse? You worked for a whole year. You're entitled to your money." "I'm not entitled to anything, father, beyond what I have had." "Il Magnifico paid you for the other and not for this one." Lodovico was emphatic. "That can only mean that he does not like this one. It can also mean that he is ill, worried about many things." "Then there is still a chance that he will pay you?" "I have no idea. You must remind him." Michelangelo shook his head in despair, returned slowly through the cold wet streets. "An artist without ideas is a mendicant, Baron. He goes begging among the hours." For the first time since he had entered D'Urbino's school 7 years before, he had no desire to draw. He avoided the formation of the word marble in his mind. His broken nose, which had given him no trouble while he was working, began to pain him. One nostril was closed completely, making it difficult for him to breathe. Again he became conscious of his ugliness. The garden was lonely. Lorenzo had suspended work on the library. The stonemasons were gone, and with them the rhythmical chipping of building blocks that was the most natural ambiente for his work. There was a feeling of transition in the air. The Plata group early came into Florence to lecture. There were no more evenings in the studiolo. Lorenzo decided that he must take a complete cure in one of his villas. with 6 months away from the palace and its duties. There he could not only eradicate his gout but lay his plans to come to grips with Savonarola. This was to be a battle to the death, he said, and he would need his full vitality. Though all the weapons were in his hands, wealth, power, control of the local government, treaties with outside city-states and nations, firm friends in all the neighboring dynasties, and Savonarola had nothing but the cloak on his back, yet Savonarola, living the life of a saint, dedicated, uncorruptible, a brilliant teacher, an executive who had already effected serious reforms in the personal life of the Tuscan clergy, as well as the indulgent life of the rich Florentines who were flocking to his side to renounce the pamperings of the flesh. Francis Savonarola seemed to have the upper hand. As part of his plan to put his affairs in order, Lorenzo made arrangements for Giovanni to be invested as cardinal, worried lest Pope Innocent VIII, an old man, should die before fulfilling his promise, and the succeeding pope, perhaps hostile to the Medici as former ones had been, refused to accept the 16-year-old youth into the ruling hierarchy of the church. Lorenzo also knew that it would be a strategic victory with the people of Florence. Michelangelo was troubled by Lorenzo's preparations for his departure to Cergy, for he had begun to hand over important business and governmental matters to Piero. If Piero were to be in command, what would life be like for him here? Piero could order him out of the palace. For that matter, what was his status, now that the sculpture garden had virtually closed down? Nothing had been said about completion money for the battle, so he could not go home. The 3 florins spending money was no longer being deposited on his washstand. He had no need for the money, but its sudden disappearance unnerved him. Who had ordered this? Lorenzo. Sir Piero da Bibbiena, perhaps thinking that it was no longer necessary since the garden was not functioning? Or was it Piero? In his irresolution, Michelangelo turned to Contessina, seeking out her company, spending hours talking to her, picking up the Divine Comedy and reading aloud to her the passages he liked best, such as the one in Canto 11 of the Inferno. Art, as best it can, doth follow nature, as pupil follows master, industry. Or, art is, so to speak, grandchild to God. From these 2 sources, mankind must take its sustenance and progress. The Platonists had urged him to write sonnets as the highest expression of man's literary thought, and had read from their own poetry in the hope of giving him insight into the art. While he was expressing himself fully in drawing, modeling and carving, he had had no need for a supplementary voice. Now in his solitude and confusion he began putting down his first stumbling lines. To Contessina. Heavenwards I am borne by an enchanting face. Naught else on earth can yield me such delight. And later. A soul none sees but I. Most exquisite, my spirit sees. He tore up the fragments, knowing them to be high-flown and adolescent, went back to the deserted garden to wander along the paths, visit the casino from which Piero had ordered all the cameos, ivories and folios of drawings to be returned to the palace. He was aching to work, but felt so empty he did not know what to work at. Sitting at his drawing board in the shed, hearing only the buzzing of insects in the wild-growing flowers, there welled up in him a sadness and sense of being alone in the world. At last Lorenzo sent for him. Would you like to come to Fassol with us? We are spending the night in the villa. In the morning Giovanni is to be invested in the body of Fassolana. It would be well for you to witness the ceremony. Later, in Rome, Giovanni will remember that you attended. He rode to Fassol in a carriage with Contessina, young Giuliano and the nurse. Contessina asked to get off at San Domenico, halfway up the hill, for she wanted to see the body to which, as a woman, she would be denied admittance to her brother's investiture. Michelangelo knew the little church intimately, having stopped off to visit it during his walks to Fiesole and the Cave Maiano. The Romanesque lower part of the facade dated back to 1050, but for Michelangelo its great beauty was in the interior, remodeled in the style of Brunelleschi. Every tiny detail of stonework, the walls, pillars, windows, altars, flawless works of art of the stonecutters of Fiesole and Sant'Agnano, including his own Topolinos. When he exclaimed over this perfection, Contessina retorted laughingly, "You're a heretic, Michelangelo, you think the importance of a church is in its artworks. Isn't it?" He was awakened 2 hours before morning light, dressed himself and joined the procession going down the hill to the Badia, where Giovanni had spent his night in prayer. His heart sank when he saw that Lorenzo was being carried on a litter. The little church sparkled in the light of 100 candles. Its walls were covered with the emblems of Giovanni's Medici ancestors. Michelangelo stood by the open door, watching the sun come up over the valley of the Mugnon. With the first streaks of dawn Pico della Mirandola passed him with a solemn nod, followed by the public notary from Florence. Giovanni knelt before the altar to receive the sacrament. High Mass was sung, the superior of the abbey blessed the insignia of Giovanni's new rank, his mantle, the broad-brimmed hat with the long tassel. The papal brief was read, ordering the investment, after which a sapphire ring, emblematic of the church's celestial foundation, was slipped onto Giovanni's finger by Canon Boso. Michelangelo left the Badia and began walking down the road to Florence. In the early spring sunlight the red roofs of the city formed a tightly interwoven pattern beneath him. At the Ponte di Mugnon he met a gaily clad deputation of the most prominent Florentine citizens, some of whom he recognized from Lorenzo's dinner table, followed by a throng of plain citizens and, as a sign that the worst of Lorenzo's troubles might be over, a large portion of Florence's clergymen, some of whom, he knew, had sworn allegiance to Savonarola, coming up to the Badia with songs and cheers to ask for a blessing from the new Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici. That night at the palace there were music and dancing and pageantry and song. That night, too, the whole of Florence was fed, supplied with wine and lavish entertainment by the Medici. 2 days later Michelangelo stood in a reception line to bid farewell to the cardinal and his cousin Giulio, who was accompanying him. Giovanni blessed Michelangelo and invited him to visit if he should ever come to Rome. All gaiety left the palace with the cardinal. Lorenzo announced his departure for Cergy. During his absence his son Piero would be in charge. It was 2 weeks since Lorenzo had left the palace. Michelangelo was sitting alone in his bedroom when he heard voices in the corridor. A thunderbolt had struck the lantern atop the Duomo and it had fallen in the direction of the Medici palace. The city went out into the streets to gaze at the smashed lantern, then turned sorrowfully toward the palace as though in mourning. The following day Savonarola seized the opportunity to preach a sermon presaging such calamities for Florence as destruction from invasion, from earthquake, fire and flood. Michelangelo stood in the dense throng listening, dug his nails into Granixi's arm. That night rumor came to him in the palace, brought by the groom of Lorenzo's secretary. Instead of getting better, Lorenzo was failing. A new doctor had been sent for, Lazzaro of Pavia, who had administered to Lorenzo a pulverized mixture of diamonds and pearls. This hitherto infallible medicine had failed to help. Lorenzo had sent for Pico and Polizana to read from his favorite authors to ease his pain. Michelangelo paced the corridors for the rest of the night in an agony of apprehension. Piero had already left for Cergy, taking Contessina and Giuliano with him. At daylight he rushed down to the basement, threw a saddle over a horse, and rode the 4 miles into the foothills to Lorenzo's beautiful villa, with its high tower, pigeon house and vegetable gardens running down the slope toward the valley. He went around the far side of the estate, slipped through the walls and made his way to the courtyard. There was a wailing coming from the kitchen. He climbed the broad staircase silently, for fear someone would hear him. At the head of the stairs he turned to his left, stood for an irresolute moment before Lorenzo's bedchamber, then slowly turned the heavy knob. The bedchamber was a large high-ceilinged room with heavy draperies covering the walls on either side of the door, the better to keep in the heat from the massive fireplace, now burning a tree-trunk. At one end Michelangelo saw Lorenzo in his high-bolstered bed, propped up with many pillows, being bled from the forearm by Dr. Pierloni. At the foot of the bed sat Pisano, the tears streaming down his face, and Pico, reading from his book, The Being and the One. He slipped behind the hanging next to the door, even as Lorenzo's confessor, standing nearby, motioned Dr. Loni to stop the bleeding and banish everyone from the bedside. He took Lorenzo's confession, gave him absolution. Michelangelo remained motionless as Pico and Pisano returned to Lorenzo's side. After a moment he heard Lorenzo in a weak voice ask that Piero be summoned from the library. A servant entered, fed Lorenzo a hot broth. Pisano asked, "How are you relishing your food, Magnifico Lorenzo?" Michelangelo saw a smile light Lorenzo's tired features. "As a dying man always does," he replied cheerfully. "I need strength to give Piero his lecture." Piero came in, his head bowed, humble in the face of death. The servants left the room. Lorenzo began to speak. "Piero, my son, you will possess the same authority in the state that I have had. But as Florence is a republic, you must realize that it has many heads. It will not be possible for you to conduct yourself on every occasion so as to please everyone. Pursue that course of conduct which strict integrity prescribes. Consult the interests of the whole community rather than the gratification of any one part. If you will do so, you will protect Florence and the Medici." Piero kissed his father on the forehead. Lorenzo motioned to Pico and Pisano to come near. "Pico, I only regret that I was not able to finish our library in the sculpture garden, for I wished you to have charge of it." There was a hurried movement from the outside hall. To Michelangelo's amazement Savonarola brushed past him, so close that he could have seized his arm. Savonarola went to Lorenzo, dropped his hood so that Lorenzo could see his face. The others fell back. "You sent for me, Lorenzo de' Medici?" "I did, Francis Savonarola. How can I serve you?" "I wish to die in charity with all men." "Then I exhort you to hold the faith." "I have always held it firmly." "If you live, I exhort you to amend your life." "I shall do so, Father." "Finally I urge you to endure death, if need be, with fortitude." "Nothing could please me more," replied Lorenzo with a weakening voice. Savonarola bowed formally, turned and started for the door. Lorenzo leaned up on his pillows, called out hoarsely, "Give me your blessing, Father, before you go." Savonarola returned, lowered his head, recited the prayers for the dying. Lorenzo, his face grave now, and pious, repeated phrases and snatches as the friar went along. Pisano and Pico gave way to uncontrollable grief. Savonarola pulled his cowl over his head, blessed Lorenzo, and departed. Lorenzo lay quietly, recouping his strength, then sent for his servants. When they surrounded his bed he bade them farewell, asking their forgiveness if he had ever offended them. Michelangelo strove with all his might not to push aside the heavy hanging, run to Lorenzo's side, drop to his knees and cry out, "I, too, have loved you. Bid me farewell." He had not been summoned here. He was an intruder, his presence unknown. And so he buried his face in the rough undersurface of the velvet, even as Lorenzo fell back on his pillow. Dr. Loni leaned over the bed, closed Lorenzo's eyes and lifted the sheet over Lorenzo's face. Michelangelo slipped out of the open door, ran down the stairs and into the vegetable garden. His heart felt swollen in his chest. He wondered how the others found it so easy to weep. His own tears were a hot-burning blindness behind his eyes as he stumbled from one furrow to another. Lorenzo was dead. He could not believe it. The truly magnificent one. How could all that great spirit and brain and talent, so alive and robust only a few months before, be gone forever? For what reason had he summoned Savonarola, his avowed destroyer, to give him this final satisfaction of seeing his threats and predictions come true? All of Florence would say that Savonarola had defeated Lorenzo, that it must have been God's will for it to have been accomplished so quickly and easily. He sat at the far end of the garden, his world smashed. With Lorenzo lying up there in his bedroom, dead, he had lost his greatest friend, the one who had taken the place in his loyalty and devotion that should have been occupied by Ludovico Buonarrotti. After a time he lurched to his feet. His throat was locked, dry. He made his way slowly back toward the palace. Coming to a well, he dropped the bucket on its comb and looked down to watch it fill. There, lying face up, was a man. Almost paralyzed with shock and fear, Michelangelo stared down into the wet darkness. Then he recognized the face. It was Dr. Loni. He had killed himself. He stifled the scream in his throat. Wrenching himself away, he ran until he was exhausted and fell. The tears came now, hot and racking, mixing with the Tuscan earth beneath him.